Good afternoon, everyone. At this time, we'd like to call to order the City Council Rail Committee meeting for the City of Palo Alto for Tuesday, January 23rd, 2004. Would the clerk please call the roll?
Councilmember Binker,
Here.
Councilmember Lowing,
Here.
Chair Burt,
Here.
all present.
Thanks. All right, our first item is public comment. This is an opportunity for members of the public to speak on any item that's not on the agenda, but that is in the purview of this committee. And do we have any speakers?
We have 3 requests to speak. Our first speaker is Jerry Underdahl.
Jerry, you're welcome right here.
Here?
Yeah, and you need to press that button.
Press this button?
Yep.
Very good. Well, I'm here. I think it may be touching on the subject that you're going to be dealing with, but I'll express it this way. I want to express my thanks and my appreciation to this committee and for everybody, the city, Caltrain, and others who have gotten us to a point where we can have a discussion about all of the options that should be considered with regard to grade separation. I know that this has been a challenge, and I want to congratulate you for the process of reopening something that many people had thought was done several years ago and have retired from considering it anymore, really, because of frustration that we aren't done. But it is a different time, different conditions. And so thank you for opening it up. And I look forward to seeing the best decision emerge when all can be considered. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Eric Nordman.
My slides. Okay.
Good afternoon. My name is Eric Nordman. I wanted to talk about one of the mysteries of the Charleston and East Meadow traffic studies. Next slide. So, and looking at the data from the existing data versus in 2019 versus the projected 2030 data, on the right, you can see I've circled in red, you know, the numbers changed, and in one case changed dramatically, a 4.5-fold increase in traffic turning right from westbound Charleston by 2030. That seemed odd to me. Next slide. In addition to that one turning motion, there's also about a 2-fold increase in the traffic on Charleston from 2019 to 2030. This didn't sort of make sense to me. The data was supposed to be done based on the Palo Alto Comprehensive Plan that projected an 8% increase in vehicle miles traveled by 2030. And a 2-fold increase didn't seem to be consistent with a 8% increase. Hexagon said this could be due to cities outside of Palo Alto whose growth were modeled by the VTA. So I looked at that. Next slide. On the right is from the Mountain View General Plan, and from 2020 to 2030, they're projecting a 7% growth in I think it was population, I guess. And for Menlo Park, they couldn't find the similar results, but they did say that they thought they would have a 16% increase in housing by 2030. Neither of these things seem to indicate that the adjacent cities could explain a 2.2 increase in traffic on Charleston. Next slide. Despite my efforts, I could never figure out how they got to this 2-fold increase. I did find out that they had done the 2030 estimate came from a combination of 2040 and 2025, I think. Sorry, 2015 plans or something. It makes sense to me that the underpass option will have a higher capacity than the other options. If you really believe the traffic will increase dramatically in the near future, it probably makes sense to go with the underpass option to prevent the intersections from being overwhelmed by traffic. These studies were done with data generated before the pandemic. It seems likely that the move of many workers to hybrid or remote work will result in a decrease rather than an increase in traffic from this projection. The data was taken in 2019, so before the pandemic. All the grade separation options improve traffic flow by eliminating train delay. If you believe traffic will not increase dramatically, the hybrid option is much less expensive, 210 million versus 380 million, and doesn't require the acquisition of 4 houses, 14 in apartment places, and 30 partial acquisitions. Since this approach was previously used by other cities, funding agencies will likely be supportive. Thank you.
Our final speaker is Anthony Pisciotto. Anthony? That concludes our public speakers.
Thank you. So we'll now go to verbal updates on interagency activities, and really the bulk of this meeting is about that. So I'm not sure what we're going to carve off in these reports versus the other 2 items on the agenda. Ripon, did you want to go by it starts with Caltrain, then VTA, and then city staff. So maybe if you'd like to just share things that aren't going to be covered elsewhere on the agenda. Yeah, thanks. Not working. You can use this.
Okay. Yeah.
Oh, I think we got it. Okay. Testing. No, I'm just kidding. Good afternoon, members of the Rail Committee, Chair Burt, Councilmember Vinker, Councilmember Lowing, and members of the public. My name is Navi Dhaliwal, Government Community Affairs Officer at Caltrain, and I'm joined by my colleague Jill Gibson, a Program Manager for the Caltrain Corridor Crossing Strategy. We wanted to take a moment to update you briefly on the corridor crossing strategy and the 4-track refinement analysis results that we presented at the previous Rail Committee presentation. In this brief update, I just wanted to share that the PC-JPB's Advocacy and Mega Projects Committee will be hearing the same update that we brought to you all previously at the last Rail Committee presentation tomorrow afternoon, just to share the results and make sure that we're keeping our corridor-wide communities engaged and up to speed on what those refinement results were. I'm going to pass it on to Jill to share a little bit more.
Great. Thanks, Navi. So just 3 to organize the corridor crossing strategy, update into 3 things. So 1, on the overall program strategy, we had the successful workshop in November, and we're planning a follow-on workshop sometime end of February, maybe early March, still working on date TBD, but that's to bring all of the jurisdictions back together and reconvene and talk about next steps for the overall program strategy and how to move forward as a corridor. So that's one piece. The second piece is, as I think we've mentioned here, but we have developed a draft delivery guide, which is a area that's a consolidated set of standards, roles, responsibilities, and processes for delivery of grade separations, closures, projects. And so the city of Palo Alto has been reviewing and providing comments. And so far we have in total about close to 300 comments from the jurisdictions, which is fantastic, right? That means the cities are engaged and providing great feedback, and we'll be working over the next several weeks to address and incorporate comments. And then ultimately, our goal is in the March timeframe, have a draft or have a document, a final document up on the Caltrain website. And again, this delivery guide is to really document as clearly as possible the process as it is today. And the program strategy is this longer term vision for bringing the corridor together to advance crossings holistically and strategically together. And as Navi mentioned, we are going to the Caltrain AMP committee tomorrow and summarizing the results of the 4-track refinement work that we talked about at the last rail committee that we were at. And so we'll be providing a summary of the result of our analysis, which just the high points, if you recall, were 4-track segments at Millbrae, Hayward, Hillsdale, Redwood City, and then 1.9 mile segment here in the city of Palo Alto. And then that will be continuing to work quite closely with staff on how that is integrated into the Connecting Palo Alto project. That, happy to take any questions or.
Yeah, if you could just share for folks who may not be fully up to speed on the two things, the corridor-wide strategy. There were I think 3 different approaches that were evaluated, what those were.
Yep.
And where things look like they're headed. And then second, just refresh everyone, because not everybody that's here today was at our previous meeting, on within the 4-track segment in Palo Alto, a brief summary of where it looks most likely and why.
That's great. Yeah, so for the program strategy, over the last year or so, we have really taken a lens of looking at how different railroads have organized a program in a spectrum. So if you think about a spectrum from left to right, on the left side is individual projects. So each individual projects advance one at a time. That's the current kind of state of affairs for the Caltrain corridor. Right, a city is initiating in the project, and it's really on them to develop the funding plan, and ultimately cities compete against one another for funding, and that's that individual project approach. In the middle is more of a coordinated project approach, and on the far right, and I'll come back to that, and on the far right is more of a centralized delivery, where there is really a robust set of funding, and that we looked at case studies, for example, in Melbourne, Australia, and otherwise where it's like almost more of a state-funded model, where it's more top-down. And so through the various technical topics over the last year, we've looked at the different lenses on how best to, on what the best approach could be on the Caltrain corridor. And the feedback we've heard in the technical topics, I think we're coming to some level of agreement around a coordinated approach where there is really a unified and integrated planning, design, and delivery team that works really in close partnership with the cities, because we've heard loud and clear from the cities of how important it is for cities to lead the development of the overall vision of the crossing projects, and really shape the vision, and then work closely with Caltrain and other partners to see that vision is implemented through the project delivery. So that's a summary of the strategy side. Anything to add to that?
I would just add the role that the local policymaker group has had in
Yes.
that. So the local policymaker group, or LPMG, is comprised of one representative of each city on the corridor. And it meets monthly, but we've been moving toward quarterly workshops where we're really having a facilitated workshops to work through the very things that Jill was talking about. And those have been really productive. And the workshops are open not only to those representatives from each city, but to interested members of the public. So I'm not sure how people get on an invite list. Yeah, so we do post it on the project website. So it's caltrain.com, and it's CCS is the project website. But there's also a link there that you can sign up for an email to be on a list as well. You know, it occurs to me that in Palo Alto, we have our own list of everybody who gets an invite, particularly for this meeting, because they've over the several years engaged and signed up. And maybe what we should do is extend that notification to our list when those are coming
that'd be
up, so
great.
we can follow up on that.
That'd be
on
great.
our end. Yeah. And Councilmember Lowing is our city representative, and then I chair it on behalf of the Caltrain board. I will note that we're looking at other major agenda items this coming year, potentially looking at safety and security throughout the corridor, looking at station needs throughout the corridor and some other areas. So it's become a very active group that is really engaging all the cities on the corridor more than just the board representation does from different counties. Ed? Yeah.
One add, which is a perfect segue to what you just said, is it represents cities all up and down the corridors. And what we're finding out is the differences between the people up and down the corridor, yet the willingness to try to work together on everything, including funding. And at the last workshop, someone, I think it was from Mountain View or Santa Clara, said, you know, we're willing to figure out what this is. And if you need this next 2 million more than we do, then that's what we should do. So I think that's a huge value of the whole LPMG. But the differences are real. I was talking with Pat the other day about Morgan Hill said, grade steps? We don't have enough cars. We don't worry about that. So that's a little different than our problem right now. So
Well, just following up on Ed's comment on one of the big things is also what Caltrain and we as a group have been told by primarily
Yes.
federal funding agencies, that the funding for grade separations on the corridor is they want to see kind of a cohesive approach.
That's right.
And that we have a greater chance of getting large dollars collectively than we do individual cities and individual projects. I will note that that everybody bought into that in concept.
Yeah.
And then at the meeting, we actually had some of the cities that said, well, wait a minute. If I buy into that collective approach, might it mean that my project doesn't get the priority that I've been able to push forward individually? And there's a natural tension there. And I don't know how that's going to get resolved, but that's what we have. Vicki?
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to the crossings delivery guide that you mentioned, and really thank you for that. And I took a look at the draft, the 207-page draft, and just thought that members of the community might want to know that it looks like a really great resource. I wish I'd had it when I first got on this committee. It's divided into 4 sections, a background section where the first chapter is a corridor overview, to your point just now. The second section is project initiation, which has a chapter on funding and grant programs, and among others. The third is design criteria and grade crossing types. And the last is project delivery and implementation. And it really is, I understand you have 300 and some comments, but I think it'll be well worth it once it's done. I wanted to thank you for that effort.
Great. So our next is any VTA updates or Ripon?
Sorry, we don't have anyone representing VTA today, but I can move on with the staff updates on the rail projects.
Well, and since our last rail committee meeting, I think we did have the VTA joint committee on grade separations, which is an ad hoc committee of Sunnyvale, Mountain View, and Palo Alto. And we had some updates on those grade crossings there. We don't need to go into detail of the other cities. But just so everybody knows, that is another committee of VTA, because VTA is the primary funding source for the grade crossings in Santa Clara County that are active. There are 8 at-grade locations between Sunnyvale and Palo Alto, 4 of them in Palo Alto. And those different cities are at different stages on different plans. And that's where we're sharing information because frankly, that information sharing on funding sources, on cost, designs, we're all keeping each other updated. And for that matter, where one crossing might affect another. The 4-track segment, for instance, we didn't know whether it was going to go into Mountain View or be in Palo Alto entirely. And so just in case people are interested, that's another meeting to attend. All right.
Certainly. Thank you, Chair, Bert, and members of the committee. For staff is also working on the quiet zone projects in addition to the grade separation projects. And just a quick update on that is that we have procured the services of the consultant to move forward with the design on the permanent improvements that are required to implement quiet zone at Palo Alto Avenue. And we also have we are also working on an agreement which will be coming to the City Council for approval for a quiet zone study at the other 3 crossings, which is Meadow, Charleston, and Churchill Avenue. Those one will be coming forward for the council approval in February for the quiet zone study.
Before you leave the quiet zones, can I ask a question, which is that study that we're we're launching. When do we think the study will be complete, and what's the update on when we think we would actually be able to implement the Palo Alto Avenue quiet zone?
So we have 12 to 14 months expected timeline for that estimated timeline for that study to be completed. It also may depend upon the access and approvals from other agencies like FRA and California Public Utilities Commission. So there's some timeline that we have, reasonable timeline assumed in that, but yeah, 12 to 14 months would be our best estimate at this time. Second update is regarding our grants that we have received from various agencies. We had meeting with FRA staff in early December, and they have indicated that their objective is to have a funding agreement in place for preliminary engineering and environmental phase for all these three crossing, Meadow, Charleston, and Churchill by July of 2024. And that's one of the critical timelines for us to have to ensure that we move forward. And we will have our discussion on the comments that we received from Caltrans later in an agenda item. The second, also they have indicated that California High-Speed Rail Authority, maybe our NEPA agency, we are coordinating and collaborating with Caltrain and their legal staff in determining, because Caltrain will be the lead agency for NEPA and CEQA for these projects, and they are investigating at their end, and we will determine and work with California High-Speed Rail Authority and our Federal Railroad Administration and processing this in PE and environmental phase. Finally, with regards to TIRCP, which is a Cal STA funding, they have indicated that the funding has been programmed for 25-26 year for the final design phase of Churchill Avenue. So those are the updates regarding the grants that we have received. Briefly mentioning that Caltrain corridor strategy guidelines were available to staff to review and comment. We certainly have very limited staff and staff resources, but we were able to provide some comments. The deadline to these guidelines were released during the holiday time period, and the comments were due by last Friday. They have extended, however, for staff to provide some additional time to provide some comments. Still considering that we do have limited staff resources, but we'll be able to comment on some critical elements of those that Palo Alto has concerns with. Finally, a good news that we are lucky to hire a new senior planner position. We had 3 openings, and it's hard to find. And we were just able to fill only 1 position at this time, and that position will be gearing more towards the additional pedestrian bike crossings that we are looking at across the Caltrain corridor. So once so I think that concludes my staff update, and I'll be more than happy to answer any questions.
And is that all we were going to discuss on the crossing guide at this time?
So since these are only for staff and official, it's not open to public to make the comments. But if there are many comments, they can certainly forward it to our attention, and we can communicate to the Caltrain also.
Okay, so even though this is not an action item, I want to see if we have any members of the public who want to comment on any of those items, including the crossing guide.
We do have one speaker on Zoom, and he raised his hand during the item, but I'm not sure if he would like to speak on this item or item 1. Would you like me to unmute him? All right. Adrian Brandt. You should be unmuted.
Yes, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to comment on the crossings guide. I was a little disappointed in that I had asked that they include quiet zone, sort of a little toolkit, and I think that got a really short shrift from what I can see. I may have missed if there was another place in the document where it's addressed, but it looked like it was only a couple sentences. And I really want to see, because one of the main motivations that people have, apart from traffic, is reducing or eliminating horn noise for doing grade steps. So I think it's really appropriate that the crossings delivery guide include a miniature toolkit so that every city doesn't need to sort of reinvent the wheel, such as, Palo Alto, Menlo Park, Atherton. I know San Mateo has done work, and you've all kind of endeavored to do your own learning, and I think that there's a missed opportunity to have this guide really sort of encompass some of the learnings and knowledge to get to, as a primer to get cities that are interested up to speed on doing a quiet zone. Because after all, a quiet zone can be thought of as a precursor to a full grade separation. A quiet zone generally costs less than 1%, far less than 1% of the actual grade separation, and really delivers for the community a lot of benefit in terms of reducing the literally hundreds of very loud horn blasts. And as an illustration, right now down in San Diego, there's been a snag with a quiet zone down there. It's in the media if you put it in Google News, and people are losing their minds over the horns being blown again. And it just illustrates that once they're gone, people don't realize, what they've been missing. And when it comes back, it's really devastating to communities that have been enjoying quiet zones. So just wanted to point that out. The other item of the crossing guide is I was disappointed in. I think they could have gone further in addressing some of the technical elements that really are in Caltrain's purview, to really close look at loosening some of the overly restrictive or onerous design guidelines that really make grade separations millions and millions and hundreds of millions of dollars more expensive and preclude certain alternatives from even being feasible. And that has to do with vertical curves, and that ties directly into freight train speeds. So by slowing the freight trains down, instead of 45 miles an hour down to say 35, the vertical curve lengths actually get much shorter, and that means the ramping distance to change grades from one grade to another become much shorter, and suddenly extra alternatives become feasible or they become cheaper. And then the other piece, is really to go further on bridge deck thickness. There's a through truss bridge design that Caltrain even used up at the Gerald Street crossing up in San Francisco, 135-foot bridge. And that's something that it needs to be emphasized more. So thank you.
Thank you.
Chair Burt, we have one more
Okay.
speaker on Zoom.
Great.
Good afternoon. My name's Steve Rosenblum. I live in Old Palo Alto. And I think my main comment at this point is just the very tardy delivery of this draft crossing guide to the city. This is something we've needed since 2009, when high-speed rail first told us that they wanted to run their trains along the Caltrain right-of-way. We've been asking Caltrain for this information regularly, things about grades and separations and heights, and they've been mute about that until December of 2023, which is pretty late in the game. And I just want to make it clear to Palo Alto residents that the fact that we haven't made a lot of decisions on rail crossings is in large part due to the fact that Caltrain has not given us the guidance we need to make these decisions. Our contractor, AECom, has been working under certain assumptions about what those guidelines are, but Caltrain has never told us what they are until this draft report came out. And it's still only a draft, so we won't even know the final rules for another few months. So I think Palo Altans need to remember to have patience with the Rail Committee and the Council on making these decisions, because they are major decisions for our city and our transportation network. And we can't get them right without knowing what the boundary conditions are. So I'd like to thank the staff and the Council for their hard work on trying to make sense of these. And I think we'll be discussing those issues in the next item But I think, as I said, we need to make it clear that the fact that decisions haven't been made is not due to the so-called Palo Alto process, but due to a lack of feedback from Caltrain. Thank you.
Thank you. So that concludes our public comments on those updates, and we get to move into our action item, which is a review and discussion of comments received from Caltrain staff on the grade separation alternatives and to provide feedback and direction to our staff. And basically, these comments are taking the crossing guide and applying them to our design concepts.
Yes, sir.
All right. So Ripon, were you going to lead this off, or how do we proceed here?
Yes, the staff will make the presentation, and we have support of Caltrain staff to add any information.
Can you move that a little closer to you?
Kristen, if you can pull up the presentation, please. Yeah, just. So as we move on to slide 1, yeah, great. Good afternoon again, Chair and members of the committee. Ripon Bhatia, Senior Engineer with Office of Transportation, for record. Today, Caltrain staff, if you want to move forward, you can please join us at the table. Thank you. Again, thank you. Thank you, Caltrain staff, for coming and joining us here. So today we are here discussing this technical feedback we received from Caltrain as part of the service agreement between city and Caltrain on the conceptual plan alternatives that we have in consideration at this time. And noting that Caltrain is a vital partner in implementing the vision of grade separation across rail corridor, and we have been coordinating and collaborating with Caltrain staff in advancing our grade separation projects in support of to implement the design that is definitely very valuable to our community. And so today we have the team of Caltrain staff who you may already know from before, Robert Bernard, Deputy Director of Capital Planning, and Mike Rabinowitz, Principal Planner at Capital Planning, and then Edgar Torres from Kimney Horn, a rail engineer. So as we dive into our discussion today, the purpose of today's meeting is to review the comments that we have received from Caltrain and seek guidance on the specific elements that we need to address as we move forward on addressing the concerns and the comments that are brought up by Caltrain on these conceptual plans. So the objective here is to make sure we can get the direction to the staff that we can proceed with either Caltrain and or their consultant to address these concerns and our city's project consultant for material changes that may be required to address these comments. Next slide, please. So to mention our goal in a near-term condition right now is to make sure that we have a preferred alternative that we can select as we move into the preliminary engineering and environmental phase. This is really important, as I mentioned earlier, also that we do have a federal grant by Federal Railroad Administration through Rail Crossing Elimination Program. It's a competitive grant which provides us $6 million of contribution funding for preliminary engineering and environmental. And our requirements is to have a funding agreement in place by July 1st of 2024. And Caltrain and their staff, and Caltrain is key partner because they will be leading the PE and environmental phase in accordance with their capital project delivery process. And so in order to proceed with those goals and objectives, meet these objectives, we are seeking guidance so that we can implement the design changes that are sufficient for rail committee and ultimately council to support the goal of selecting the preferred alternative. Next slide, please. So most of us may be familiar with the process it has came through to date. Just to a very high level nutshell is that CAP, which is Community Advisory Panel and Extended Community Advisory Panel, through years of community outreach and involvement, developed with the consultant support alternatives back in 2020, and after deliberation made the recommendations to the City Council in March of 2021. Following XCAP recommendations, Council reviewed these alternatives and narrowed the alternatives for Meadow and Charleston Drive, as well as selected a preferred alternative and a backup selection for Churchill Avenue in November of 2021. They also authorized Rail Committee to review and refine underpass alternatives, as well as to review the council adopted evaluation criteria and conduct some additional studies that would be supportive of Rail Committee to make the narrow down or select the local preferred alternative. So those additional refinements and additional studies were completed in 2023. And also at the same time, since this project is within the jurisdiction of, impacts the jurisdiction of Caltrain, we have a obligation to coordinate and work with Caltrain to look at, get their review done, and as they will be the implementing agency for the local preferred alternative or the grade separation at these crossings. Next slide, please. So we did engage with Caltrain and got into a service agreement with Caltrain to review our conceptual plans to review to vet the viability of the alternatives that we have in consideration, to ensure that the compliance of those alternatives according to the Caltrain criteria, documentation, as well as standards. And so that was our service agreement that we have as first stage received the comments back in November 2023, and since then we have been coordinating and collaborating to understand the impacts and implications of those comments and how we can move forward, and we are here today to discuss those comments. Next slide, please. So our staff report summarized, we received more than 200 comments on these various alternatives, and these comments were summarized in various categories and identified in 8 buckets that relates to vertical alignment, horizontal alignment, port tracking, roadway design, construction technology, culverts, cost estimates, and cumulative concerns. And they were discussed in detail in our staff report. And so I won't go more into the details of individual ones, but what we plan to go forward with is to look at each of these alternatives and how these comments relate to each of these alternatives for especially the major elements. Next slide, please. I like to note that there are 2 items that were in the staff report that we need to have little correction. The vertical alignment, which characterized that we needed a 16.5 feet vertical clearance for vehicular traffic under the railroad was not specified enough to indicate that it is for the entire width of the Caltrain right-of-way. That is now the new standard, or that has been the standard, and that needs to be consideration as we design and move forward. So that was not clear in the staff report.
And I just, in layman's terms, make sure everybody understands the implication of that. So when we have an underpass and we had to start dipping down from either one direction or two directions to go under the tracks, we have two changes. One, we thought we needed 15.5 feet vertical clearance from the bottom of the roadway to the bottom of the bridge deck. And that's 16.5 feet. But also, we had been under the understanding that 15.5 or 16.5 feet now applied to where we built and basically an overpass. And instead, Caltrain is saying it has to go out, that theoretical 16.5 feet has to go all the way out to the width of the corridor, which means that the ramp coming from each direction has to start considerably sooner and potentially affecting more property. So I just want to make sure everybody understood what that means.
Correct, and that would require some reprofiling of the roadway. It could also impact the driveways that are on both sides of the roadway, as well as the right-of-way takes that is envisioned. And at like said, Churchill Avenue, it might extend all the way to Cassaleya Valley intersection, and or at Meadow and Charleston, it could also impact Park Boulevard and or Meadow and Charleston intersections as well. So yes. Next slide, please. And I like to also make the correction on the second element, which was about the vertical dimension from top of the rail to the top of the roadway. It was originally understood that this would be applicable to all bridges and in different alternatives. However, with further discussions with Caltrain staff, we were clarified that it is only applicable for viaduct alternative. And the reason behind that is that the viaduct will use a high rail, and therefore it would require an additional segment above the bridge deck because the long segments of the railroad requires a different configuration of the rail track, not the inlay type, but it would require the high rail type. So just wanted to make that two clarifications on the staff report that was previously noted.
But can you explain the implication of that? How does that affect the ability to do a viaduct?
The vertical dimension would just add cost, and the length of the ramp, the length of the viaduct at the transitions. So those one would be the major implications for the viaduct alternative. But there are other measures that will be more significant than this for viaduct alternative. And the fact that additional height will also create more shadow and more impact to the neighboring properties if they are adding that additional height.
Yeah, just to be clear, so it's 4 feet higher than what we thought the viaduct
3.5
was. Yeah, 3.5.
Next slide, please. Okay, so to go with a summary of comments for Churchill Avenue, we have primarily the comments relates to the right-of-way encroachment. The active transportation facilities by Caltrain policy requires that all these improvements be outside of Caltrain's right-of-way. And if that's not feasible, that would need to go through JPB board approval. Next slide, please. So you can see in this closer option 1 that the ramps, which are in yellow, as well as the underground passageway in brown, they are in Caltrain's right of way, and so those ramps are kind of required to be outside the Caltrain's right of way, and therefore would require additional right of way from the private properties in order to accommodate that. And that pedestrian pathway needs to be extended all the way to the Caltrain right away. And the option would be to go back to the JPB board, because the board only has, there is a process of utilizing Caltrain right away and seeking that authorization, but that's on that needs to be followed in case if city wants to pursue this alternative. Next slide, please.
Sorry, through the chair. It might be helpful to just note what, as you go through these, which ones are new since we went through the XCAP process, so people can understand the difference. So as an example, this is when we knew and we flagged, and it's on the matrix that we have, that original matrix, but there will be others that are not, and so.
Correct. So as XCAP, Nadia mentioned, yes, we as a staff and XCAP and were aware of the right-of-way encroachments, and they were identified in our matrix also that this does not follows the Caltrain policies, and therefore additional approvals will be needed from the Caltrain. Sure.
I just want to, following up on that request for the providing the vertical clearance for the full width of the right of way has been in our standards for the last 20 years. So it's not a new one. It's what you'll see all railroads do, is you keep the full width for your right of way. So you maintain utility and use of your right of way. The change from 15.6 to 16.6 is a new requirement with the new emerging standards. So just to answer your question, which ones were old, which ones are new?
Thank you. I think there's actually so what I was referring to is the encroachment on the Caltrain right away, which we were aware of. But that's good to know, because I don't think any of our drawings included an end-to-end width of the right of way clearance, whether it was 15 or 16, I'm not sure, but
But that's a longstanding requirement.
Which is going to go into an interesting discussion, because we had our consultants who had worked with us on these alternatives, and why is this not part of what they were identifying and flagging is an important question. Yeah, Vicky.
Mr. Chair, would you like to hold a discussion or have it now of, I'm curious what JPB board approval processes are like and what they're likely to lead to? Is that better left for later, or when would you like to have that conversation?
No, I think it helps frame our thinking on the rest of it. So maybe we can have an update on it's kind of a little back and forth order here, but that will help us think about which of these are cast in stone and which ones are the policy, but exceptions can occur at one level, variances going to the board. So Rob, can you share a little bit of that with us?
And I guess when you do, I'd be curious, like how lengthy these procedures typically are, you know, how costly they are to us. If you have any handicap of, you know, typically these go through, or typically they're viewed with, you know, some higher degree of stringency, that would be helpful as well. Thank you.
So I appreciate that. So so it might be good to provide just a little bit of context at this point. You know, this alignment's been providing passenger service on this corridor for the last 160 years as of this month. And we've transformed from steam to diesel to now electric. And so really we're at that point of we're transforming the railroad. And with that electrified service, it's kind of caused some changes in how we do business. And how can we make sure that the community's investment in that $2+ billion for the electrified service is put to the intended use? So if you walk back in time, I'm only been here at Caltrain for 3 years, and many of you have much longer histories in this community than I do. But looking back, you know, we set our very first design criteria in 2007. We said in our policy statement in the criteria, preserve the existing right-of-way. That was a standard. Moving forward to 2011, it was the same, preserve the existing right-of-way. And then the transformation starts to come forward with the introduction of high-speed rail in the agreement in 2018 for blended service. And then the adoption in 2019 of our service vision to take the trains from 4 trains an hour to 6 trains an hour to 8 trains an hour, plus 4 for high-speed rail going 110 miles an hour. And then you electrify it. That's a different railroad than we used to have. And those 2011 standards, which a lot of these things were predicated on, the Hillsdale station, for example, or the South San Francisco station, that was the 2011 standards. But now we have the 2020, and then we're adopting new standards for 2024 and publishing those up on our website here in the coming weeks. And that's kind of changed. And so in that 2020, they added, still preserve the right of way, but plus to make allowances for current and future Caltrain operational and maintenance needs, because the railroad's been changing. And so the board said, yeah, but we want to add not just that be the staff, but have it be a board level discussion. And so they established the rail corridor use policy to give some structured framework for these sorts of conversations, because it is a blend between how do we provide rail service that's safe and efficient, is economic to maintain, but still be a good community partner. And these are conversations and sometimes complex. So they established some board level policies and procedures. And so there's a form to fill out. The staff does some review. There's a staff recommendation to the board, and it goes to the board for consideration. So it's not an exhaustive year-long process, but it does take doing some homework. But it is that for the board to make those decisions, not the staff, because now it's become more nuanced in trying to balance those two, be a good community partner, but still maintain the efficiency of the railroad and leverage the investment that the public has made in this new facility. So that's that new process that the board established in February of 2020 with that emerging with the electrified environment. So it's not it'll take years, but it does take some homework for us to walk through that, because it is really a board level decision with recommendations from the staff after some kind of careful review of the implications. Does that answer part of your question?
Yes, it answers part of my question. Did you have more or should I ask more?
Ask more.
Okay. So do we not yet have any precedent to see how this goes?
We've done a couple of them with some developments where we went through the process, and our team participated from the engineering side of the house. It's run out of the planning department, and I'm not sure exactly the exactly duration, but we've taken a couple to the board for their consideration with recommendations.
And how big is and who sits on the board?
It's a 9-member board, and
That's the,
Councilmember Burt is on that board.
okay, so
We have 9 members, 3 members from each of the 3 counties that comprise the Joint Power Authority.
thank you.
And then there's a variance process. Councilmember Burt asked about what you're cast in stone. And so a variance is essentially the last resort. The engineers have turned all of the knobs and taken a look at what is the I can't make it work without getting a variance. It's not where you go to first, it's where you go to last in that process. And so it really is taking a look at exploring all the different interrelated disciplines and doing an exhaustive analysis, because it really is, how does it affect right-of-way and the homes in the community? How does it affect public and private utilities? What about drainage? What about the track profile grade? What about operations, the user experience? And really doing that exhaustive analysis to understand the trade-offs in order to make that evaluation for a variance. But a variance is an item of last resort where you couldn't make the standards work. So that's a process where it goes through, it's a kind of an engineering review as opposed to a board level review.
If it's an engineering review, then does any factors of like cost, does that not come in at this level? Because if you could do it, but it's going to be 10x, I'm just making that up, that would affect our decision.
It is it's a professional judgment of looking at the, it's interesting when you look at how different organizations take a look at that. If you were to look at Union Pacific Railroads, for example, there is specifically cost shall not be considered. But we're a public agency trying to be a good community partner. So it is a conversation, but it is taking a look at an exhaustive review to really understand the differences.
Okay, thank you. I think the word I was searching for was feasibility, because sometimes it's infeasible if it's extraordinarily expensive. But it sounds like you use what we lawyers call the totality of the circumstances.
I'm far from being a lawyer.
All right, thank you.
Can I follow
Ed?
on?
Yeah.
That's exactly the question that I had written down, which you just covered very well. But the thing I wanted to push on was within the totality of the, what did you say those? Circumstances. There must be some that are weighted. Because the ones that you ticked off, the engineering, the maintenance going forward, unknown options and so on. And the one that concerns me the most of all those is eminent domain. So it seems to me like that should be elevated and weighted in a project like this. So if we have to, oh, we got to take down another whole block of houses because we need all these things. That's a huge deal.
Right.
That's more than cost in terms of the impact on any community. So it seems like that should be elevated and weighted in the appeal if it gets to that.
And so, like I said, it is a structured process looking at trying to understand the totality of the situation. But a variance is of the last resort, is that you've tried all the other things to make it work, and that it's not a precedent setting. It's, you did it over here, means you can do it over here. The policy is a variance is based on the unique conditions after an exhaustive analysis and review of the totality. But
I think I'm getting a different answer than what I hoped for. Because what I'm saying is that in the case of eminent domain, you could say this project is doable if we take out that block. But we don't want to do that. So we'd like that to be not a constraint of more than X houses per mile or something that gets you going and gives you some sort of standard.
It is an evaluation case by case because the details matter. So I can't give you the answer you're looking for. It is an evaluation that needs to be done to understand the trade-offs.
Let me follow up on a couple aspects of this, because it sounds like this is an area that gets to a lot of the meat of very important issues. So one is on the timing side, as Ripon reviewed, we have our federal grant that we have a deadline to select a preferred alternative, and a number of these technical issues go into our decisions on preferred alternatives. And the ability to be able to go through this process in time is a real question mark. So let me ask that question first, so I don't throw too many at you at once. So how does that process align with our timing needs?
So as part of conceptual planning, it is usually a best practice to do the designs that show compliance with the stated standards and with the preferred clearances. And so at the conceptual planning, you're trying to evaluate what's the likely possible footprint for this particular alternative. What's the benefit and the impacts? So you can weigh the different alternatives by understanding those. And if you try to advance and say, I'm not going to do the preferred clearance, I'm going to do the minimum clearance, and I'm going to assume variances. When you take a look at the alternative, it's not really showing the stakeholders the possible footprint. And when you go to do what's the environmental impact of these various alternatives, it's not really accurately reflecting here's what the footprint could look like to help us in effective evaluation of the choices. And so it usually is from a practice perspective, is to use the criteria in the planning phases in order to show that maximum extent of footprint. And then as you advance into preliminary engineering and you understand where the utilities are at, where the right-of-way takes are at, all of the details of all those interrelated disciplines, then the designers start to turn those knobs when they have a better understanding of the trade-offs. Now, that being said, it's important in the planning phase to raise your hand and say, I think for this one, because of right-of-way impacts the community, we might need a variance. We still have an exhaustive analysis to know whether those trade-offs, whether the variance will be granted. But it's good to raise the hand early that one might be necessary in the planning process. That's appropriate. But to show the alternatives as if the variances aren't there, so you can understand here's what that impact might be to help with the understanding the trade-offs. So it's just a philosophical difference approach. And I'm not the engineer, I'm an architect, but Edgar, did I get anything, mischaracterize anything there?
No, that's accurate. And then the other part of my question is this process that we have to go through for variances that could impact our preferred alternative selection. How does that align with the timing between now and July?
So,
because I'm concerned that they are misaligned.
And if I could spare you, every single one of our alternatives, I think, has a variance. We have a handy chart that will show you because we knew some of the standards, not all, but we knew that even with the standards you'd given us, this thing barely fits. I mean, we're down to fighting about 6 inches, right? So to Pat's point, I don't know how we meet the timeline.
I know that there have been numerous community meetings along this journey. I know that there have been thousands of hours of work by volunteers, by consultants, by city staff, evaluating these alternatives. They've produced all sorts of illustrations at the plan view sections, nice 3D images of what the alternatives, there's been exhaustive matrix. But I think at the end of the day, we want to provide information to support good decision-making. And so is there a way to say, okay, here's the alternative as we see it today, with cranking every knob we can, but here's what it would look like with a simple outline overlay of what the footprint might be if we can't work those variances. So we can understand the extent of the impacts of the choices. And so it really is a way to show it simply. We went to working with your neighbor, Menlo Park. Menlo Park was at 30% design. The 30% design had the ramps in our right of way. Pedestrian undercrossing. The undercrossing only went underneath the width of our tracks. And we said that doesn't comply with our standards. We would need to go to the board for a rail corridor use variance. And we don't know whether you're going to get to a yes with that. And so I got to sit shoulder to shoulder with their city staff, going to their council to re-adopt their LPA, showing the ramps outside the right of way and the underpass going the full width. Now, there was a strong desire for the user experience to try to make that tunnel shorter. We said, well, we could probably work collaboratively to say, can we find a way to evaluate whether we can make the open part of it so it daylights earlier, but build the bottom part of the U now. And eventually we could put a cap on it if we needed it. And you'd agree to pay for the cost of putting the cap on if we needed to expand that at some point to allow us to full use our right of way. But let's look for a creative solution here. And so we went to the city council, but they had to re-adopt their LPA to show a different outcome. And they had a simple one-page illustration. Said, here's what it looked like before. Here's a simple illustration of what it looks like now, and we're re-adopting the LPA without going through the exhaustive review and all the 3D illustrations and all the matrix and all the cost estimates. So they elected to do it very simply. But that's a choice of the community. What product do they need to provide good information to the community and to the elected officials to support decision-making? And Menlo Park chose a very simple illustration, but it was a very simple project. It was just an underpassing with 2 ramps. I mean, it wasn't very complex. So, I mean, that was a choice they made. So but we want to do something because we're motivated, we've got money. Money's really, really hard to get. We don't want to lose the money. We want to get to July. We want to be able to support decision-making, and we're leaning in hard to help. And so we want to be a good collaborative partner and lean in hard. We provided 200 comments to be helpful because this is the point where you need to make informed choices, and we're providing, feedback to support that process, not to be the, oh, here comes a railroad and they're going to put their, their foot down. It's no, we're trying to help with providing comments.
So that's helpful. I will say that, in the case of that Menlo Park pedestrian underramp, it added to cost. It made the user experience not quite as good, but it wasn't, they had room on either side. It wasn't a deal killer.
Right.
Whereas in our case, these are, I think, more significant ramifications. And I still want to go into my other questions, but I don't think I have a good sense yet of my question I keep asking, which is how quickly are we going to be able to go through this process where we're in almost February and we've got to have decisions really by June or May. And we've got this process we've got to go through.
You won't, a variance is evaluated during preliminary engineering when you have good information on all the interrelated disciplines. The variances aren't granted during the conceptual planning phase. The variances are after exhaustive evaluation with hard engineering.
So this sounds like we can't even seek a variance before the time frame in which we'd have to make a decision.
And so that's why it's kind of a best practice to show here's what the footprint would look like. We are going to be seeking variances and trying to turn the knobs, but here's where with all the knobs are turned, what it would look like. And here's what it would look like if we're unsuccessful with these variances after the deep dive analysis to show the range of each of those alternatives.
Okay, but how do we pick an alternative between now and when we need to without knowing or having a better sense of whether we'll be able to achieve a variance? That might be critical.
And it might be helpful. I think what I'm hearing being said to my right is that when you do that, we realize we can't go forward with any of the alternatives without a variance. So it's not like we can, just do, I think, what you were saying.
So if your community has been working on these alternatives for a long time and they know them very well and much better than I do. But when we stood back and took a look at them, we kind of get some emerging understanding of the alternatives, at least for the Churchill Meadow, and say, okay, there's a viaduct and there's lots of nuances on the viaduct and going through all our various review comments, but that a viaduct is really, what's its footprint on the community? Its footprint on the community will change the skyline for Palo Alto forever. That's its footprint. And elevated structures have the opportunity to enhance the character of a community. We have all seen signature bridges, right? And we've also seen structures that don't do that, that are more utilitarian. But that is essentially a impact the footprint on the community's skyline. And it has a pretty broad reach. It also is the most expensive, but that's a value proposition. Sometimes you pay money for a signature structure because it adds value. The St. Louis Arch is a big piece of concrete, right? But it is a signature. The underpass holds the railroad harmless. We're just going under, but it has a pretty big impact on the community going east and west. And without variances, that impact gets bigger and the right-of-way gets bigger. And that's a concern, but that's one of the alternatives So one has a footprint in the skyline, the other has more of a footprint on the ground level on the roads. And then the hybrid allows you to turn all the various knobs, make the railroad go up some, make the road go down deeper, the road shallower, shorter impact, longer impact. It allows you to turn some knobs to kind of spread the impact in kind of in a local area. So each one of these choices, although there's lots of different nuances, it's where does the city in that choice want that impact? Does it want to impact the skyline? Does it want to do the
Rob,
roads? So yeah, I know you
we've
guys
struggled
know
with
it
these
very, very
basic
well.
things, but we're still going to come down to, say, those three choices in Charleston East Meadow.
Right.
How do we make a decision if we don't know if we are going to be able to obtain critical variances or not? There's a chicken and egg problem, and it's a big one. It's like an ostrich egg.
It sounds to me like you're saying, do it boilerplate for your grants and then make changes later. And I don't think that works.
I think you have, I mean, it is your community, it's your decision making. We are a service provider. We're trying to lean in as a partner. But it's here's what this footprint looks like with all the knobs turned, and here's what the outline of what that might look like if it doesn't. For example, if we provide the full width of the right of way per our standards from 2003 and the 16'6", the road profile goes another 120 feet this way and another 120 feet that way. It's a simple outline on a drawing that says, here's the possible extent of this alternative. So at least they have the understanding when I'm making this choice, this is the potential implication of it.
Yeah, we get that. But when we look at that, the alternatives of without turning knobs and with turning knobs, and we go, well, if we can turn the knobs and mitigate those impacts, we'd select that alternative versus the other. We might select the underpass versus the hybrid or the viaduct if we could turn those knobs and not have as much of an impact on the community. But if we don't know that, we can't make that decision well. That's the problem, the crux that I'm trying to get at. And framing the broad issues, we get that.
Yeah.
We get it. We get it.
You've been doing it for a decade.
Yeah. And so we don't need to have that explained to us more. I need to get to the understanding of, are you saying that we're going to have to make a decision based on our own guess, whether you're going to approve a variance or not down the road, and say, well, we're going to select this alternative because we're assuming we're going to get the variances, even though we can't get any indication whether we will or we won't, or we reject it because we can't make that assumption. That's the crux of the problem. That's what I'm trying to get from you, is how do we address that?
So it would be a value for us to walk through the various alternatives. For example, let's take the 16'6" versus 15'6" for the vertical clearance. Metrolink, for example, in their standards, would allow a variance provided that the sponsoring agency provides a sacrificial beam. So an oversized truck hits that beam first and then requires an agreement between the railroad and the sponsoring agents to pay for the cost to repair the structure and the cost for the loss operation. Because of not meeting the criteria, it puts the risk on the agent, on the railroad versus the sponsoring agent. So there are ways, so we have to walk through each one that's an example.
That's a hold harmless kind of.
Right. Another example is the MSE wall that's shown to be 10 feet away from the operating railroad. We said it should be 20 feet. The standard is 25, but we said 20. That was with the understanding, in order to build that wall next to an electrified railroad, you can't be within 10 feet of that 25 kV line by code. So you have to power it down. Now, the last train leaves like 1 something in the morning. The first train comes at 5 something in the morning. There's about 3.5 hours where there's no train service. So it takes a half hour to power it down, half hour to power it back up. So there's a 2.5 hour construction window. You could build that wall at 10 feet, but you could only work on it 2.5 hours a day. So we were saying that should really be 20 feet away because it makes it more constructible. It's not that you couldn't do it. It's just, it'd be really hard, expensive. So each one of these is a conversation.
Well, let me jump to one that Philip already identified it's maybe the biggest one, which is this vertical alignment that is required, where it's 15.5 or 16.5, the whole width of the corridor. And as I thought about that, you mentioned that that's been on the books since '07. That's when, if I'm recalling kind of this correctly, that's when Caltrain was needing to anticipate the prospect of high-speed rail sharing the corridor, which was an anticipation of 4 tracks throughout the corridor. The voters then approved that in the high-speed rail bond in '08, and then that became a reality for 3 or 4 years. So it was anticipated in the '07 standards.
It was the '03 standards. But
'03, okay. And then it was a reality up until the blended system was adopted as the approach by the legislature, which means that we now have passing tracks on the corridor, and that's one of the discussions. And the location is south of Churchill, just south of Churchill, but not impacting that Churchill interchange. And so the need for that entire envelope of the corridor to be preserved was really based upon anticipating 4 tracks. Now there's a principle that says, well, we want to keep it everywhere. But from a practical standpoint, we have an anticipation for the next at least 40 years that we're not going to have a need in that location for the whole corridor to be utilized by Caltrain because it's state law. We're not going to have 4-track system throughout the length of the corridor. So there's a hypothetical guiding principle that we're going to preserve it, but it's very disconnected from anything that is anticipated at any level at this point in time. So then we run up against, okay, there's a hypothetical versus there's nothing on the horizon that would need that. Still a principle that we'd like to keep, as we as Caltrain would like to keep that latitude everywhere. And then there's the added question of, okay, we're not building something that interferes and would have to get torn down that is a Caltrain crossing. What we're doing is potentially building a ramp that in 40 or 50 years, if something completely unforeseen happened, we'd have to rebuild that ramp. So that goes into a category of, can there be that kind of a responsibility and risk that says, okay, we'll own that. We'll have to make that decision, but that possibility. So that's an area that I think we need to have a deeper discussion.
Right.
And those are big ones.
Right. And I at the end of the day, you know, as you well know, this has been here, corridor's been here for 160 years. And railroads, one of the critical business needs is to preserve that right of way, because you never know how you might need to use it for maintenance, for sidings, for other things. And that's why that you see that in almost every railroad, they're going to have that requirement. And if it is seeking to not provide that, essentially it's it's a right-of-way taking because it means that we can't use the full width of our right-of-way. And if there's a right-of-way taking, then that's a board level decision based on a conversation of these competing needs. So it's because it ends up, I believe, if I were to frame it, in my understanding, that it would be essentially be a right-of-way take because we could no longer use part of our property. That would be a board level discussion to talk
Maybe.
about those trade-offs.
But we, for instance, at Churchill already have a right-of-way intrusion on both sides. We have it on the southbound right turn lane intrudes in the right-of-way, and our bike path on the west side intrudes in the right-of-way. And yet, both of those things were allowed by Caltrain. And I will, on that 160-year time frame, if we take the 160 and even add the 40 that we can see forward in terms of not needing to go beyond the blended system, that's 200 years and we never needed it. And yet, that wanting to hold on to that latitude has a major impact.
Right, and that's why the board said, let's establish for right-of-way takes. These are complex issues and a lot of interplay between the railroad's needs.
And we haven't called them takes. I think we've called them, I don't know.
Take's not the right word, maybe.
Yeah.
But it's like a temporary easement.
Yeah.
Right? It is, but the board realized that these are complex and they need consideration from multiple views as opposed to just our engineers. The engineer said, just do, preserve the right of way. Engineer, that's a black and a white. Realize that these are more complex and need more of that board level discussion because it's more of a policy in the interplay. And so that's why those sorts of things, they establish that process specifically to help us with these conversations. So it's not just the engineer in our room.
Yeah.
If I may.
Yeah.
Oh, please.
Yes, with regards to the example you described in terms of the turning lane, that's in a condition in which everything's at grade, right? So when we start talking about clearances, it's only clearances just from the track and the safety of the crossing and the safety of the users vis-a-vis vehicles and pedestrians. Once you start talking about grade separations, you're now talking about structures and the ability to be able to provide safe space for maintenance and clear lines of sight for different individuals. So now you're talking about horizontal clearances that need to be met that are different than an at-grade condition. And that's part of the discussion right now in terms of these concepts is really coming back to the horizontal and vertical clearances as you brought up earlier. And being able to say what can be allowed as a variance now without incurring too much of a risk to both the decision makers vis-a-vis the city and Caltrain vis-a-vis the railroad operator, right? And that's the dialogue that the conversation that Rob's mentioning. In this case, I think what would be helpful is to be able to go through these concepts a little bit more to be able to provide context for those around the table and online to be able to understand what are those locations and be able to provide a little bit more concrete examples of those trade-offs.
And I this was really one of the biggest ones, and we've been able to kind of through this discourse talk about what we've been struggling with over the last month. Rippon's met with you several times. We had a last meeting a few days ago that I was able to join, and we've really been zeroing in on these important issues. I would say that, for instance, in the case of that vertical alignment, we're not talking about building a bridge that would interfere with Caltrain. We're talking about air. We're talking about what isn't there that is being hypothesized that someday, for an unknown reason, outside of all plans, theoretically could have a need. And that's what we're talking about. And maybe that still is so overwhelming to Caltrain that they wouldn't be able to, willing to grant that. But that's what we're talking about. We're not talking about something that interferes. We'll hear about later that we now understand that we need a 10-foot roadway access for maintenance of the line that's off of the tracks. That means we have to add 10 feet to the width of the bridges. That's something that we have to build, and I think we get that. We're not tickle pink about it, but we get it. That's different from saying that we can't build a ramp because we would interfere with air rights.
The utility, the railroad right away.
Yeah. Okay.
All right, Chair.
Vicky, you had something else? I'm sorry, and then Ripon.
Well, I just very quickly, I think where this is going actually makes my comment very narrow, because this is the way to do it, because we understand that some not all variances are equal, right? Not all are as easily granted, depending on what they are. What I wanted to say to those on that side of the table about us on this side of the table is that we, as the chair said, we've talked about this for a long time. There's not a clear winner necessarily amongst all of our community. There are some mixed minds. There are some close calls. It's not like we just said, oh, we want this. Now can we do it? That may have been okay or in other cities at certain crossings. We're not in that boat. So there might be one that's like a leading candidate and we're leaning that way. But if that variance is wickedly unlikely and we're going to lose time and money and embarrassment with our city, that's a big factor to us if the variance on one may be a little less desirable, really likely to be granted. So I think that's why we're asking, is because we don't have that scenario that perhaps you were describing where we say, we look at how it looks and all that and decide X. It's a totality of the circumstances on this side of the table too. So.
Yeah, and I like to note that in my recent conversations with other peers, it seems like most of the recent designs and construction did not have that 100 feet and the entire right of way width clearance. So we can clarify that if the recent construction or designs.
You mean elsewhere in the corridor?
Correct.
Yeah, I'd be interested in hearing about those when we get into that.
So through the chair, so just
Yeah.
time check, it's 4, yeah,
Yeah.
and Ripon's only on slide 11. But I do think it's important, one of the things that's covered in the staff report that really, like, we could go through this in painful detail, and trust me, I'm here for all the gory details. But the reality is that your largest question from a policy perspective is, can you, in the time frame necessary before July, get from either an AECom contract or a Caltrain contract some kind of footprinting that would show you how off we were on our numbers and what the blowback is, and which alternatives need variances, and spoiler alert, I think every single one of them does, then and could we get that in time for them to be able to at least make some choices to be able to sign with the feds in July? That is above all. Like, we could go into the details of 10 feet here and a clearance there, but if we don't have a sense of, if we give this back to you, Caltrain, can you make it? I'm not sure what we're talking about.
Okay, back to Ripon.
So I can.
But I think this framed all the rest of the discussion.
Correct. So let's go into the partial underpass. Actually, we were back at the option 2. And fortunately, that one met all the criteria so far. There was no major significant comments on the option 2. So the closure option 2 primarily meets the criteria. Next slide, please. For Churchill partial underpass, as we discussed significantly, that the active transportation facilities and our other roadway facilities should be outside of the Caltrain right of way. That is one of the primary concern. In addition, 16.5 feet vertical clearance for the extent of the Caltrain right of way instead of 15.5 feet under the Caltrain bridge or the bridge would be a new criteria. In addition, a bridge width widening to provide for the access of Caltrain maintenance and emergency vehicles. This is also some newer requirement to the project. And yes, so that's 10 feet clearance for Caltrain maintenance and emergency vehicles, but there are some other maintenance requirements also, 10 feet and 20 feet, like Rob mentioned earlier in the presentation. And then there are certain roadway design features which are mostly on the city facilities that were also pointed out that should meet Caltrain or HDM highway design manual or ASTRO requirements. So those are some of the brief.
So on that last point, I just want to make sure everybody understands. So that's Caltrain's requirements.
Correct.
And not, I shouldn't have called it quite requirements. They're guidelines more, right?
So they do have standards and guidelines and different, and there are processes for getting an exemption for that. And especially if we have a state funding, that's when we would need to have a design exception from them. If it is all totally city funding, then we would not need any of such requirements. But that's on the city facilities for majority of them. But, you know, the Caltrain folks were kind enough to provide some additional feedback on some of these things that may be related, somewhat related, but overall on the roadway design features as well. Next slide, please. So this slide actually graphically represents what was said in the previous slide. Shows where the extend the bridge width to provide for the additional maintenance vehicles. Maintenance and emergency vehicles also indicates the active transportation facilities that should be placed outside of Caltrain right of way. So I like to note here that this is at Kellogg Avenue, and we have a consideration for a bike ped facility at Seal Avenue, which will be similar to the option 2, and therefore that will definitely have a should not impact the right of way on Caltrain. That option would be. So this particular element probably gives more incentive for us to go over with the Seal rather than continuing with the Kellogg. Other comments regarding the vertical clearance was mentioned, it will definitely affect the roadway profile, driveways along that segment, and also it could encroach into the intersections, nearby intersections like at Castalia and Pali Avenue. So next slide, please. For Meadow Charleston underpass, similar major elements that would be applicable here as well, providing 16.5 feet vertical clearance requirements for the extent of the Caltrain right of way, and for the roadway and pedestrian facilities, 10 feet. Also widening the bridge to provide for the Caltrain maintenance and emergency vehicle access, and adjusting retaining walls to be outside of the Caltrain right of way, and additional horizontal clearances like 10 feet for maintenance of walls and vehicle access, and also for doing any construction in the vicinity of the overhead facilities. So there are certain requirements that we need to make sure that we adhere to. And in addition, roadway design requirements to meet with to conform with Caltrain Highway Design Manual and our AASHTO requirements. So next slide, please. On this slide, again, graphically represents those where these comments are applicable. Bridge width, primarily at the crossing, the vehicular crossing, at the railroad bridge, and then just wall foundations to be outside. So some of these wall foundations are shown to be right at the right-of-way line, and so they need to be outside in the city's right-of-way in entirety. And the Caltrain minimum vertical clearance is shown on to the right in the profile. In addition, they have also indicated the 10 feet clearance, minimum vertical clearance for the pedestrian facilities. We have one of the facility on Meadow underpass design where it does not have, it has 8 feet clearance only as shown. Also want to note that both Churchill and Meadow underpass would have certain design requirements to meet for the forward tracking, like we mentioned, the new forward tracking segment that was never previously considered, but we need to make sure that is in consideration as we move forward on this redesign efforts. Next slide, please. The Charleston underpass would have the similar requirements for bridge to be widened to provide maintenance and emergency vehicle access, minimum vertical clearances for the roadway bridges, and a 10-foot clearance for the pedestrian facilities all across the Caltrain right of way. So that's an additional across our additional Caltrain right of way. Next slide, please. The hybrid alternative also have the same vertical clearance to make sure that we have sufficient maintenance vehicle room on the bridge, as well as along the one side of the tracks, that there is enough space for the for maintenance vehicles. So that is an added comment. Make sure that our retaining walls can accommodate 4-track transitions for hybrid at Meadow, and then there are requirements for MSE walls to be 20 feet from the center of the shoe fly, as Rob mentioned earlier in our discussion. So those are some of the constructability clearance requirements that are brought up that could affect the overall design of the hybrid alternative. Next slide, please. So this slide graphically shows all the comments that were summarized in the previous slide. Make sure that the design is compatible with 100 miles per hour design speed for the passenger vehicle or commuter rail. Segments to be designed to accommodate 4 tracking on the transitions for Meadow Drive North. Vertical clearance and any grades that exceed 1% would go through a variance process. The hybrid in this particular situation meets the 1% requirements, but if we were to change the rail profile to accommodate additional height, that's where it might have exceed 1%, but it's something that can be approved and they have made a little lenient process to make that approval at the director of engineering level rather than going through the variance process. And so next slide, please. Yeah, we can make. So this slide particularly hones on to the intersection level and looks at the bridge, additional bridge widening that's required to accommodate emergency and maintenance vehicles along the corridor and at the bridge also. So for the hybrid, we need to widen not just at the bridge, but it might require widening on the embankment sides also for Meadow Drive. And the 10-foot clearance that's shown on the walls, on both sides of the MSE walls, retaining walls and barriers, where trains are coming into the embankment area. So that's where we need to have some additional clearances that are mentioned. And in order for the constructability, we require to have some additional clearances between the OCS poles and the walls to make sure that they are constructible. Vertical clearance similar to other locations, but that's where it could affect some of the driveways. It would be also impacting Parkside and Meadow Drive intersection. Could also get into that location. Next slide, please. Next slide. So the viaduct has similar conditions, but since it's all in it's all raised structure, the vertical clearance, like I mentioned before, was 16.5 feet, but then it also the top of the rail, due to the type of the construction, would also increase the height of the structure to 24 feet at the top of the rail rather than the 20.5 feet that was previously assumed in our conceptual designs. The bridge width to provide access for Caltrain maintenance and emergency. I believe that's not the case. It's more for the catwalk. It's not for the vehicles. It's more for the catwalk only. This is an error, maybe a duplicate from another slide. Adjust retaining walls to accommodate 4-track and 4-track transitions. And this is similar to how we would have it for hybrid. And provide sufficient space of 10 feet for maintenance vehicles and access on the for Caltrain right away. So that's on both sides of the Caltrain right away on underneath the. Yeah, go ahead if you want to clarify.
Yeah, just one clarification in terms of the vertical dimension. It was 24 feet that was shown in terms of the viaduct. And there's a couple of things there. One is the viaduct structure. These are typically slightly longer spans for viaduct. They could be shortened. The second is that this is not ballasted rail up on top, and so it's typically a direct on plinth. So think of it as a direct fixation of a rail with onto concrete. And so that requires a little bit more separation. When that occurs, then you need to have a catwalk for your passengers, because now we don't have you don't want to build an extra wide structure in this case because it's for a longer stretch for a viaduct versus a bridge. You're only spending the width of the roadway. This would be a much longer stretch. And then with regards to sufficient space for maintenance, for the viaduct, it is not an additional 10 feet adjacent to the railroad. Typically on viaducts, the maintenance vehicles go what's called on high rail. So it's a vehicle that's specially designed to have both rubber tire and rail wheels so that they're able to then transition from, say, a roadway condition onto the rail, and then they're able to maintain the assets on the viaduct. And that's why we look for those opportunities to be able to have those transitions. And those are typically as quite a distance away from the crossing because of how long the viaduct could be. So it can't be in those vertical transitions.
Edgar, could you just explain, it's my recollection of the viaduct, and I'm a little rusty, but was basically the advantage in terms of time was that we were, the way it was originally designed is we would not need two fly tracks because we would use the existing tracks, and the viaduct would be designed on basically the Alma Street side for the public. And now I understand that with the kind of clearances that we're talking about, the location of that might have to be different. Could you say a little bit more about what that would be and how that impacts it?
Yeah, it may need to be different, and that's part of the discussion with staff. In terms of being able to provide those clearances from the railroad, the active railroad, especially now that it's electrified, that viaduct may need to shift. Now I say may because there could be different construction techniques or construction space made available. For example, Alma Street, one lane could be shut down or a little bit more if necessary, and not going into detail, but that's an option that could be utilized to then construct from the street side versus the railroad side. So there are ways in which that could possibly happen. However, that's a much more detailed constructability review. This was just an initial a review from a constructability perspective relative to the concepts.
But would we do this review at this stage to determine?
So it's based on the information that's given. As of right now, these options, at least the viaduct option, still looks viable. And so just from an engineering perspective, it does appear viable. There are options to be able to address that particular concern about clearance from the railroad and clearance from the road.
Requires a variance
It may require a variance.
for the 2%. Both the
Oh,
hybrid
sorry.
and the viaduct, I think.
Very good question. If it's right now, if you want to speak to it, but Caltrain is exploring that.
So as part of the delivery guide, we're proposing to change our standard where anything above a 1% was a variance, and that's of last resort. Nothing else worked. And to remove that constraint and say you're allowed up to beyond 1% to 2% only requires the review of the director of engineering because the details really do matter. Okay. But no longer of a last resort. So to try to provide more flexibility, we wanted to increase the clearance underneath the deck to provide factors of safety, and that's where the railroad industry is going to 16.6, but also loosen that standard to make it more attainable.
And that's the exception. Is that what you describe as the exception when it goes to the head of engineering
Just
versus the board?
Well, there's a director of engineering review.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's from 1% to 2%. A variance is still the director of engineering, but the framing is different. It's of last resort, exhaustive analysis. And then there is the board's established in order to use the railroad's property, the board said that's a board level decision, not a staff level decision, because they're complex with all the community interaction, community lenses that need to be looked at it.
So I wanted to follow up on one thing Edgar was talking about on that on the viaduct, we could use the maintenance vehicle that is both steel wheel and rubber wheel, right?
High rail vehicle, yes.
what's it called?
High rail.
High rail. And that would be the length of wherever we have a viaduct. That's how we would do it. You don't need you have a catwalk, but you don't need that 10 feet of roadway access, right?
Correct, because of the nature of the maintenance of the structure versus the rail versus the OCS. So a distinction between the viaduct and the hybrid. In the viaduct condition, it is a structure that then is specifically supporting the rail. Versus in the hybrid, it's the retaining walls retaining the soil that is supporting the rail through ties and through ballast. So it's two different conditions that are being maintained by the railroad.
But either way, with the viaduct, we're saying that we could do maintenance from the rail, from the tracks. We'd have a vehicle that would do the maintenance from the tracks rather than having to be on a roadway 10 feet wide adjacent to the tracks, correct?
Correct.
So that leads to my question as I go back and adding this 10-foot roadway to our I'll call them our overpasses, even if we're underpassing, but our structure at an interchange. So why can we have a mile of viaduct that doesn't have that roadway access? We can in fact use the tracks, but on 100 feet or so of a roadway, we're saying, nope, you got to build a bigger bridge to provide for that 10-foot roadway access. Why can't we use the tracks in that short distance?
Yeah, the observation is presumed on the operations and maintenance being the same in both conditions. In other words, the windows available for maintenance staff. In the case of the viaduct, those windows are actually much shorter, as Rob mentioned, in terms of being able to de-energize and re-energize the catenary, the OCS system. In the case of a hybrid, you don't have to do that because you have that 10-foot space. Think of a railroad that when a vehicle is either near it or on it, it is called fouling the track. It's no longer available to the railroad to be able to utilize for operations. And so in the case of this 10-foot space, it allows for that vehicle to be outside of the track to be allowed for
Wouldn't we
that.
be fouling the track
You are.
whenever we have a problem with a viaduct?
And so there's an operations and maintenance component for each of these that were not explicitly discussed as part of the comments. However, they're still a factor when looking at those.
But my question is,
during preliminary engineering.
if we can allow for that for, I'll call it a mile length of a viaduct or a half mile, whatever it is, why can't we allow it for 100 feet where we have a bridge?
I can't speak to that.
Okay, good. That's encouraging.
No, it is an operations and maintenance trade-off that would need to be discussed with Caltrain's operations and.
Okay, well, I would
Caltrain's
frame it
engineering.
that way. When
Yes.
I first heard about this at the bridge and go, oh, no, now we have to make all of our bridges 10 feet wider.
But I mean, a viaduct is a different structure than your tie and ballast. And so it has, they inspect the rail on a regular basis. And so there's a track crew that's out in a vehicle, driving along the alignment, inspecting the track, getting out and inspecting the track. And so they don't foul the track. When you go to do the viaduct, it's a different structure type and a different track system. And so that is okay for this particular area. It's because it's a mile long. You've got a 2 hour or 2.5 hour window, and it has kind of a different way of doing it. But it is a fair question, but it drives out of our operation and maintenance folks. We know how they do that work much better than I do, but it is a fair question.
And there's one other follow-up that I neglected to ask about related to the vertical alignment and that theoretical envelope. A member of the public had asked me, well, why can't we build our bridge now for 2 tracks, and The allowance for the future need is that if Caltrain ever needed to put 2 more tracks on the outside, you elevate them by a foot or 2. And you get your 16.5-foot clearance, and we didn't have to alter our ramp. We just elevated the tracks by a foot or 2 in that future scenario 50 years from now. If we ever had to build 2 more tracks, they're a foot or 2 higher than the inner tracks. Why wouldn't that work?
To track that.
It can, however, it would need to be designed to allow for that. There would need to be ability to be able to show how that not only design would be constructed in its initial setting, but also to be able to demonstrate the ability to be able to design and construct that secondary condition. And it's not always as easy as described, because it's the ability to be able to construct it. That is part of the sequence of review.
Okay, I hear you, but
Remember, you also now have the OCS. And so picking that OCS usually runs in about half-mile segments. It's in order to raise the OCS is also different than where we were before, where it was just a track.
okay, but we're talking about contingency planning for something that will probably never happen, and as opposed to contingency planning for something that's likely to happen. Okay. All right, go ahead.
Sorry. Next slide. So this slide kind of corresponds to the previous comments that shows graphically that the transition segments for the 4 tracking, the 1% grade. So here the viaduct grade is 1% on one side and 1.4% on the other side. So therefore it won't require any variance, probably get at the Department of Engineering approval level to approve. And the vertical clearance underneath the roadways that was previously mentioned also to increase to 24 feet. And so that's where the vertical, height of the viaduct will be increased. And the comments that relates to filling the retaining walls to accommodate the 2-track and 4-track segments shown on the top. Noting that some of the comments that were briefly mentioned that the horizontal and vertical clearances, and that's one of the reasons we were looking at that. If we have to maintain those vertical and horizontal clearances, that the alignment of this viaduct could change, and that was a concern, that how much flexibility we have as it relates to the deviating from the standard of the 20 feet minimum or 15 feet, or looking from the constructability perspective, if we can use Alma Street to construct and be able to allow that happening. So those are some of the questions that we need to probably hash out as we move forward. Yes.
I saw that you mentioned culverts on the first or second page, but I just want to point it out to everyone on this slide because it's an important factor for us. Both the Adobe Creek and what's the other one, Barron Creek, in the hybrid and the viaduct alternatives, one of the things that they pointed out is that basically you're adding structure basically in the vicinity of a creek, and that adds weight, which means you have to reconstruct the culverts of both of those creeks, whether it's the hybrid alternative or the viaduct alternative, to be able to withstand the extra 10 feet of stuff on top. And I don't know how big of a deal it is, but I can just say from XCAP's experience, every time we said we were going to touch the creek, people would start screaming and talking about fish and wildlife and all sorts of things. I don't know if that's what happens when we rebuild an existing creek that already has a culvert versus the other creeks. But it is, when you guys are talking about the factor of footprint and variance, I just want to point out that a major thing for the policymakers is understanding time to construct and additional price. And so when we're asking about whether we can make those federal deadlines, it's not just about the footprints and the technical stuff, it's also price and eminent domain and these other factors. So I just want to make sure we didn't miss that.
And that's why we had it as a comment that just, it's like the Palo Alto is the road authority, the roads within their jurisdiction. Our engineers saw something, we raised our hand. It's like, although we're talking about the tracks and there's some culverts here, and those are usually pretty complex to get the permitting process. I've done a number of those, and we just was raising hands, like, eyes wide open. So.
Sure. I think what I'm saying is if ultimately the work goes back to you guys, part of the quick analysis that needs to happen, it's not just a quick and dirty on the engineering footprint, is what would that mean in terms of cost and time for the alternatives, because ultimately those play into the deciding factors.
And with relative to that, I'm not sure if there can be some alternative design, like to have like like viaduct structure over that particular segment area and then continue with the retaining fill, or do we have to have all earth, embankment? So I'm not sure if there are other value engineering analysis that we can do to determine that, so in the future phases.
But my favorite answer is that doesn't happen until preliminary engineering, and by then we're already, chosen something.
And that's, therein lies part of the challenge. Yes, are there engineering techniques for this lightweight fill? You could bridge, sort of span that from a structural perspective, piles to be able to go below the culverts. So there are options. That's just something that's not explored just yet.
Yeah. So next slide, please. I think so on this one, it further elaborates on the maintenance and the horizontal clearances that are required and the vertical clearances that were shown as part of the comments that we received from Caltrain. So next slide. So this, so we are coming back to our discussion now on the next steps that we can take, having known all these technical comments and how that integrates into our plans, guidance from the Rail Committee on certain, more impactful comments like right-of-way encroachment, horizontal clearances, and vertical clearances, and how and what direction does Rail Committee feels that we should take, and then also what would be our direction on how we could in the next steps as we use our city's project consultant or use the consultant services through Caltrain, leveraging their existing contracts that are in place. And if we were to go through our consultant contract expires in April, and we don't have enough contracting capacity, so we would have to go through amendments, and that would require the procurement and council action, which will take some time. So noting all those additional elements, finding out what's the best strategy forward as we move forward in this achieving our goal and objective.
That's what we have to do in the next hour?
Yeah. And we're going to need to hear from the public before we have that discussion. And before we hear from the public, I want to invite up Lou Thompson to join us and offer any insights. I think most of you were introduced to Lou previously, but Lou is an expert advisor to both Caltrain and now is offered to be to the city. Now he's a Channing House resident. He has a bit of a background in rail, having been he's a chair of the High Speed Rail Peer Review Committee, and on that committee for the last 14 years. Before that, almost 2 decades heading the World Bank program on rail, and before that, FTA leading the Excella corridor construction and a few other things, but other than that, he's a rookie. So Lou, just any feedback or insights or questions that you have, we'd certainly welcome.
Okay, well, you will note that I'm sitting at the end of the table and not really on either side, which I'd like to do. But I guess what I would like to say is that engineering standards are the engineer's definition of the way we would really like to have it, because that means we don't have to think about it. We'll just do it that way. They are never absolute. They are always subject to workarounds or compromises or other solutions. And in this case, I think the standards that I am hearing, I have encountered these many, many times. And the first answer is always, no, we can't do that. That's always the first answer. The second answer is that, well, we'd have to think about that. Okay, we're reaching that point now. The third answer is, I think, to make a list of all of the variants that you're interested in one place, and then sit down and have a real discussion about how would we solve these problems, not their problems, but how do we solve them? And for example, the issue of the full track-wide clearance, that is not necessary in this case. Those areas where you're going to have 4 tracks in the future, you have to provide for that. And I think that's agreed. But those areas where you're not going to have 4 tracks, the capacity of this railway has been modeled and checked, and you know exactly where those 4 track sections are. Without that, there's never going to be a need for more 4 tracks or other, other things like that. So it will be a case of reducing it down to what we would really like to have, to how do we work together to minimize our cost as well as yours. And I would add that the idea of the underpasses specifically minimizes the adverse impact on Caltrans. That's one of the main objectives in this, because it means they don't have to worry about the way they change their operations and the way you build around when they're instructing. So that's a real value to them that they should take into account in the planning of what is the right way to work out the answer. But this should not proceed from this assumption that these standards are absolute. They are not, and they don't need to be.
Thank you. That'll be a good starting point for that sit down that we have with Caltrain. It's very helpful. Thanks. All right, let's go on to members of the public who wish to speak.
Our first member of the public is Anthony Pisciotto. Eric Nordman.
Good afternoon. My name is Eric Nordman, and I had a few comments on the Caltrain design review. A number of the designs reviewed have been recognized as less desirable. For example, there were 3 bike ped crossings for Churchill area reviewed by Caltrans staff, even though Seal has been identified as a preferred location. Going forward, it might be desirable to get council approval to formally remove obsolete options such as these and the trench option. At Churchill, Caltrans indicated that the northbound merge was too quick given the ramp. It seems a safe solution would be to have the right 2 lanes that are at ground level merge into 1 lane so the ramp traffic doesn't merge. From Caltrans, some preliminary feedback of this is likely to be problematic or this is likely to be okay would be very helpful to allow the council to make a more informed decision. Caltrans said they need a 10-foot wide maintenance path along the track. It probably would be good to clarify that whether this is needed on both sides or on only one side of the track. I guess my final comment is that Philip had mentioned that April 2024 was when council should be making a decision on a preferred and bottom option for Meadow Charleston. And I'm curious as to how this review changes that schedule. Thank you.
Next is Stephen Rosenblum.
Hi, Steve Rosenblum again. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. I'd first like to again compliment staff on the masterful job they've done of integrating all this Caltrain feedback into the existing proposals for the crossings. I think it really shows a huge amount of effort on their part. On the other hand, I'm really very disappointed in the lack of cooperativeness evinced by Caltrain on helping us make these difficult decisions, especially in view of the fact they've been so tardy at coming to the table with their requirements. We're supposed to be partners in this process, not adversaries. And they have to understand that Palo Alto real estate is extremely valuable. And as it was pointed out, eminent domain is a lightning rod issue in this community. And if they're going to ask people to give up their houses in order for them to satisfy some nominal engineering criterion without giving us any indication of how likely they're going to give us a variance to do that, I really think that's unreasonable, especially in light of our short time frame for this the upcoming grant in July. So I think it's time for Caltrain to really come to the table and cooperate with us, rather than saying this is what we need and you have to figure out how to do it. And I think the first place to do this is with the 1% versus 2% grade. This is an issue we've talked about for a decade now. And finally, we're hearing that we can get the director of engineering to approve it. Well, let's put in for that immediately on our whole, the whole Palo Alto corridor, that from the Mountain View border to the Menlo Park border, that 2% grade is okay with the director of engineering. Because that at least gives us some assurance that that assumption, which has gone into every design we've come up with so far, except for the ones that don't require elevating the train. So I think that would be a minimum. You know, we've heard that variances are a last resort, and director of engineering decisions are not. So let's go with that one as a test of goodwill and see if they're willing to come to the table on that. Thank you.
I'm not sure I understand.
Our final speaker is Adrian Brandt.
Thank you. I must say, I completely agree with Lou Thompson's comments. I think we really need to be careful about treating excessively, with excessive sacrosanctness and reverence these engineering standards, many of which are quite arbitrary or would be nice type of requirements. The 2% grade is absolutely doable, and nowhere else in the world, do they require, even on Caltrain, a 10-foot vehicular access road on elevated tracks. Even Caltrain has a 135-foot through girder bridge that it installed across Gerald Avenue in San Francisco, and the Guadalupe bridges that they're working on now between Tamian and San Jose. These are all ballasted bridges, just like you'll see all over the place, all over the world, and they do not have a 10-foot roadway, which is outrageous in my view. To maintain the ballasted track there, that's very common everywhere in the world. So I'm not sure where that requirement comes from. Also on the viaducts, do not understand the additional height that we're talking about now with direct fixation track, as Mr. Barnard talked about. There's no ballast. The track is directly affixed to a concrete understructure. And I do not understand whatsoever why there's additional height required, especially if a U-shaped viaduct is used where the strength members are on the sides instead of underneath. So that's similar to a through girder bridge, where the high walls support the bridge, and it allows for a very reasonably thin bridge deck, and allows for the tracks not to be quite so high in the air, by a few feet less. So those are all issues that I think really need to be looked at carefully. There's just a whole, I think, a sense of non-cooperativeness here that really disappoints me, as to Mr. Rosenblum's comment, as sort of a no-can-do approach. And I think there needs to be a lot more collaboration in figuring out how to solve these problems. They all can be solved, from what I can tell. And I just really want to see Caltrain be a little bit more, a little less doctrinaire and a little bit more flexible, especially in areas where clearly, if you look at the rest of the world's railroads, can and should be done. Lastly, I just wanted to point out, the viaduct is not just a cost on the community in terms of profile, but it also creates a new linear usable space underneath, as we see with the Olone Greenway here in the Bay Area, and also the new project, the Davis Diamond, I think it's called, in Toronto, where they're doing a wonderful new community connecting space underneath. So thank you.
Thank you. All right. So I think that now returns us to other questions, and then discussion about the recommendation on how we proceed in the coming months. So first, any other questions or comments, Vicky?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just one comment preliminary to going into some of these specifics about variances. Which is, we've talked about how the rules, the trains and the rules have evolved over the 160 years. And, obviously the benefits to us have evolved as well because commute patterns have changed. And so there's additional help to us for that. The greenhouse gas emission reduction goals, there's benefit to us of that. But there's also obviously been an increased risk to our residents for having, higher speed, more trains going through our town, which is obviously why we're talking about this with the grade SEP. And Ms. Nayak pointed out to me that while we've been sitting here, there was a vehicle struck at one of our crossings at grade. So this is serious, and this is now, and the risk of Caltrain trains going through our community is increasing. And so we really do need to partner with you to try to get this dealt with, also in time to get these federal dollars. And so I just wanted to ask a preliminary question going into this, the theme we've talked about a lot in terms of timing. But if this does really need to get to council by April, this committee probably needs to deal with it by March, which means JPB hearings would just have to be held by March. So is it feasible, doable, that the JPB, that we can get this to a shape to go and talk about variances, fill out your forms and gather the group together within 60 days? Because I think that's what we're talking about.
Let me just add that to be able to accomplish that, I think that we're going to need to have a follow-up meeting between our staff and others, not only with our technical team at Caltrain, but perhaps with the Caltrain CEO, who can help us referee these things on a more expedited basis. And so, Rob, any other comments here?
Yeah, I just want to note that the Caltrain team has been working very collaboratively with Palo Alto. And this was the first service agreement we had to provide our review comments. And this was, here's what the standards say, so we can begin discussions on the art of the possible. It's like the 15.6 versus 16.6. There's solutions for that. I talked about the sacrificial beam, what others do is to how to thread that needle and the conversation. So this is, what did our standards say? And here's what the standards say, provide those review comments. That's not the end of the discussion. That's the start of the discussion now that we can have those conversations. But how do we drive those in a timely manner to get the answers that you need? And that's how do we wander around that problem to find a solution? Because at the top of the meeting, we talked about trying to need to get that solution to secure that money, because that's important. So that's a start of, we know what the issues are. Now let's work the problem.
Well, on that, if I may, on that same theme, on this question on recommendation number 2, whether we would engage with Caltrain staff and or the city's project consultant, I think it brings up a value to engaging, and that can mean essentially, like we've done in the last months, hiring Caltrain staff to be part of this review process where we bring them in to the problem solving. So we came up with design, they came up with initial set of concerns and problems with it. And I think this is kind of implying that our best and most efficient route would be to really bring Caltrain into the process of, okay, how do we solve these problems? As opposed to, Caltrain has this set of interests, we have these, we negotiate, but instead it really brings them fully on board. So I just wanted to say that's kind of where my thinking is headed. Rob, did you?
Well, yeah, just an example. The comment from the team was, okay, you've got a retaining wall that's next to one of Palo Alto's roads. If you put a 10-foot clearance to allow maintenance vehicles to inspect that wall, we wouldn't need to request to drop a lane. That doesn't mean that it can't be built without that 10 feet. It's just that conversation with the local jurisdiction. Okay, if we put the wall here, when we go to need to inspect it, we're going to need to ask to drop a lane, and that's an impact to the community. Versus the other trade-off of if we do that, that might impact houses. Well, I'd rather, as a community, drop a lane versus take a house, and it'd be okay for you to drop the lane to do your inspection. But we're just saying, you know, to not do that, we would ask for 10 feet. That's that conversation that I think that Councilmember Burt's talking about, is helping us work collaboratively at that problem solving to talk about the trade-offs.
That's great news. Can that be done in 60 days? I mean, I'm just stuck on this time thing because I think there's engineering considerations, there's administrative, there's management considerations at your end. Can we work together? Well, can you commit? I guess if it's a non-starter, we should know now. And if it's something you'll commit to working together with us to really do, we'll go pedal to the metal and do our best to be good partners. But if that's impossible, I'd like to know today.
Sorry, but that's exactly what I was going to say the second time. It is. My opening statement was going to be, this has been a grim meeting in terms of what we now confront. But very, very quickly, we have to get to reality.
Right.
And if the reality is, you know, the conversations are going to last 9 months, not 60 days, we got to get there really fast. So I would say to the chair particularly, this needs to be a very intensive 60 days and see where we can get. And that then backs into who does it, what are the deliverables, that kind of thing, because we don't have 60 days to negotiate a contract either.
So I have a slightly different take. I want to say I've been doing this since 2017 at this point, working with Caltrain on these things, and I have seen it change. I mean, this is part of the reason why we're like, hurry up, could you just tell us if we could have a variances? Because we've been waiting for variances for a very long time, right? And I appreciate that you guys are new to this, but I mean, you can hear it from the quality of the comments from the public. Like, they know their stuff, and they know their stuff because they've been fed this stuff for years, and there's been a lot of advocacy on this stuff. And I think the corridor crossing strategy is an amazing booklet. If we'd had that to train our XCAP, we would have moved, you know, noticeably faster. So I do feel like we're making progress. I think it's super clear for everyone to understand that you're not going to get the answers on these variances at all, because that has to happen in preliminary engineering. What you need to understand before then to be able to get to that, to do your least preferred alternative, is understand the footprint, probably some basic costs, and see how those numbers have moved. Constructability, right? If we come up against anything that we can't do, and price, you know, because we need help. Part of your contract is also sort of reviewing what those cost estimates are. And in light of like, okay, these are the cost estimates that you were given, but with this new stuff, what might it be? Because I hear you saying we have to apply with basically, we have to think about this in worst case scenarios and then turn the knobs during project engineering or preliminary engineering. I think that's what we're trying to understand. So I think we could probably make it. It's going to depend on your time. And I'm thinking we're going to be see a whole lot of each other. And I will just say, I come from a time when we had rail committee once a week. I know that that's like the last thing you want to hear. But in the days of high-speed rail, that's how it went. And on the days that we weren't meeting once a week, I was in here with the city manager and some of other council members. So you can do it, but we're all going to become real close.
Is there also in walking around the art of the possible, an opportunity to take two alternatives into preliminary engineering to get you to that 15% design point? We've really dived in a little deeper. And then when you get to that point, select one to go from 15 to 30%. Is there a way to, we get part of the way there? Okay, there's 3 on the table. Maybe one doesn't really work for the community as well as the others. And there's 2 that have some ranges.
Right.
And advance 2 to the next level to get to maybe 15%. It's just an idea.
Yeah, well, so technically you guys there's 3 alternatives on the table that the council has put forward. The hybrid for Meadow and Charleston, it's the hybrid, the underpass, and oh my God, the hybrid, the underpass, and the trench. Thank you. But we had them look at the viaduct over the trench, right?
And the trench is looking very unlikely.
Right.
So even though it's officially there, it's not looking likely.
So that means you technically only have 2, even though you looked at the viaduct, but you're going to have to make some decisions of whether you still had the right to on the table and whether you're going to remove the trench. That would at least give the staff maybe enough time to be able to advance 2 of those and go forward.
And tied to that, what is your capacity to give a lot of focus to this over the next couple months? If we, even if they're not in these public meetings, you're meeting with our staff and going through all these things in a deep dive to try and problem solve it. Do you have the capacity to do that?
So we would lean on our,
You know, on Edgar?
there's a conversation.
We're leaning on Ripon, so.
I mean, there is a conversation AECom is the author of these products. And although we have AECom under on-call contract, and we could use the service agreement, have the money flow through and us use AECom to maintain that ownership. Could have Palo Alto staff direct AECom, and we just provide the contracting vehicle. But know that we would lean in with our staff and our experts in order to help with that, to work in a collaborative. You know, we want to be a good community partner. There's a timeline. Money is precious. It's really hard to get. We don't want to lose it. We want to advance this and look at what knobs we can and can't turn, what decisions we can and can't make it with the information we have, but try to bring those resources to bear. So that is one notion for the city to think about.
And Lou, would you like to join us with your thoughts?
If I may. In listening to this, a lot of these variants seem to me more like policy than engineering. And I think if you get a good list of them and separate them, for example, the issue of complete clearance of the right of way, that's not an engineering issue, that's a policy issue. And that should be resolvable pretty quickly after, you know, a good discussion. There may be some that will require adroit engineering. That's where your risk would be if you make an assumption about you're going to do it this way and later on you find out you can't. So at least one effort should be to try to separate these variant issues between what's a policy and what's a real engineering issue. If you can do that, that'll save. The other point I wanted to make is that realistically, if there are options that just aren't going to get done, even though they're sort of theoretical, it would save a lot of everybody's time if you can admit that and say, let's focus on those that really we might do, because that reduces their work and your work and everybody.
To build on what Lou said it's the full width of the right of way. That's a policy. It's retaining walls in the right of way. That's policy. Those are things, ramps in the right of way. Those are policy level decisions. And the board says those are mine to make. And so staff is, well, that's a board level decision. We can point out that the policy is not to, but those are the policy level discussions. The vertical clearance, that's there's engineering and ways to walk around that. So I think that's very helpful.
So Ripon, your thoughts on what Rob had talked about on kind of a hybrid approach of how we incorporate AECom to add resources, whether that we go through a contract with Caltrain to do that, or through our own engagement with AECom. And have you, do you know on standpoint of AECom, how quickly they could respond to some of these pricing issues and otherwise to meet our tight timeline?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, so we did ask AECom to start working on looking at some of those costs for addressing these comments, and they could be as simple as looking at a basic level to revising all those alternatives to have renderings, fact sheets, and plans and profiles to be updated to reflect the desired guidelines. So we are already asking it, but I think it goes through the procurement process to do the amendment and get through the city.
You hit my next question, and I see we have Kylie here. So my memory is we would have to add on to the AECom contract. It doesn't have any other funding sitting there, right?
So there is some existing funding that was allocated for preliminary review of the for tracking. That's still available in the contract, but my understanding is that may not be sufficient to form these exercises.
So, yeah, so we could get it kickstarted maybe
Right.
with that. And does that give us enough runway to be able to get a contract amendment to the council and approved?
So we have about 100 grand, but we will look at least an additional 100 to, depending upon the level of details that we want. It could go as much as 500. Another thing I need to note is that if these conversations can occur at the at our preliminary, which seems like it's going to have to occur at the preliminary engineering and phase, and or if there's a possibility to eliminate at least one of the alternatives and continuing with 2 alternatives for each location, we can have more detailed discussions through our preliminary engineering phase, have all this work be as part of the preliminary engineering and design phase. And what that will do is all that work will qualify towards a grant, and we don't have to look at the timeline of that. So there is some efficiencies that we can create from the funding perspective as well as timing perspective if we move forward and do some due diligence and look at. It seems from the comments and back and forth, it seems like a lot of these constraints that are brought up are resolvable in many ways. There are certain ones which we sure know that like right away is the key one, which we already knew from the day one, and we had already heightened that as a constraint that was a knowable fact that we would need to go through JPB approval. And if that's the risk that we want to take and proceed forward with, and some of the other ones that are critical to Caltrain that we can identify upfront, like Councilmember Wienke said, that the ones that are kind of deal breakers, like what are that are not feasible or adjustable or resolvable, those are the ones we would like to know upfront. And if there is a direction on that one that we can move forward with, then we can get into the PE and environmental phase and have these as reviewed as part of PE and environmental phase. I mean, that's just another thought, but
Right. It's like the MSE wall being 10 feet from the overhead contact system. That's 25 kV. You could build it there because it's a temporary structure, but it would be enormously expensive because there's a limited window. Or 20 feet, so you could build it more economically, but then it has a footprint on the community. And so that's not Caltrain a policy. That's just the constructability side of the house, and just taking a look at, how do we actually build the facility and the implications of that. And this is what it would mean if it's at 10 feet, and if it moved to 20, then it has implication. Those are things that aren't necessary policy. They're not necessary engineering standards. It's just how do you build the thing? And so those are conversations that there's choices. Edgar, did I understand it correctly?
Yes.
to add to that, aren't we looking at also like looking at different constructing strategy like CMGC or different contracting strategy where contractors can come in early on in this discovery phase and maybe able to have that additional insight into the constructability aspects of it, because we haven't built these grade crossings like but there are contractors who have done it, and they would have more innovative ways to construct these with limited impacts and may be feasible, which we may be thinking up front. Right now, it's not feasible.
You could also, if you did an evaluation for alternative contract delivery, and if CMGC were the optimal delivery method, you could bring the contractor on earlier and get commercial pricing from the contractor to help support decision making, and do those constructability analysis to explore what are the most efficient and optimal way to build them, even at the 15% design, to get that contractor input. Might be a way to help in the decision making, advance a couple to take a deeper dive underneath the hood, and then make the decision a little farther down with a little better, more information to give a little more runway.
And I had just want to make sure on this, on the funding part, we can tap into Measure B dollars for this, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so it's not going to negatively impact our budget. Yeah.
Do you think in the next 5 minutes, we could give guidance on the two alternatives for each? Just so they would have, what they could work on primarily?
You mean, yeah.
Where'd she go? Oh, there she is. Nadia was saying if we could get down to two alternatives at the most, right? That
Yeah.
would just be narrowing down what we're analyzing. So
I think, and I'm not the city attorney, but I think the problem that you run into is that I don't think it's agendized that way. So you could, and I think you have to go to council to basically get that answer. And so that becomes how quickly can you get on city council?
I was suggesting to do it simply for sort of costing purposes. It didn't mean we were tied to those agendas, to those alternatives, but it gave us some cost estimates for the ones that are in the mix. So let's say there's 7 in the mix, we're picking 4 to get costed so that's guidelines, and it might help accelerate to our funding.
So this goes to, without the committee actually even recommending to the council to eliminate an alternative, can we give guidance to request that they have additional study on an expedited basis, a subset, maybe just 2 of the Charleston East Meadow?
Yes, that's fine.
Okay, that helps.
Yeah, and thank you for that, because again, what I want to share is we can't, as a committee, just say, here's 2. And so that's part, and we don't have time to go to council, say, are these the right 2, and come back and then talk to you to go back. So I like this.
But I guess is have Caltrain staff work with city staff, bring our talented consultant resources to bear on both sides, and look at each one of those items and talk about what's the art of the possible to understand what that footprint might be and where there might be a likely variance or an accommodation. And so you could understand the problem and begin to work the problem in these next 60 days in order to support a future decision by city council to pick an locally preferred alternatives to go to the next level. But what could staff do now to support that future decision by council?
So if we're tentatively setting aside the trench, we have 2 that the council has officially has remaining as alternatives, the hybrid and the underpass. We have the viaduct that we've been waiting to go back to council. We had a staff committee recommendation that it be rediscussed by the council. We didn't recommend one way or another whether it should become one of the alternatives. But my question is for colleagues, given that the council hasn't endorsed the viaduct as something that they want to consider, does that kind of narrow our options right now to looking at the hybrid and the underpass and that's the direction we give? And it seems like it's a bit more of a stretch to say we want the viaduct to be one of those when the council hasn't even supported putting the viaduct back on the table.
I think that's a good suggestion. I would support that.
And I'm seeing Kylie nod and Tim.
I mean, ultimately to the committee's discussion, I think that is a more prudent path with the committee taking the guidance from the council that you have to date. And ultimately, whatever the recommendation is from this committee to the full council will be, this committee recommends to the full council, and you'll have the funding, to Councilmember or Vice Mayor Lowing's point, associated with the narrowed options. So I think it would be a prudent measure to make it go as smoothly as possible with your colleagues.
Yeah, and there's a tension here. I mean, I'm leaning that way as well. My concern is by not pursuing it now and given the grant funding timing, if we're in effect permanently taking it off the table. That is my concern. But on the other hand, based on what we've heard from the comments from Caltrain, it looks like the viaduct has become a less desirable option. I know, didn't go into it more beyond that, but there are additional things we would have to change in order to choose that one. So it's, I think this may be our only path if we pursue this particular funding, and then we would have a decision to make at the end, whether or not we want to bring the viaduct back.
Well, the other
in-
ingredient
as
that
a
I'm
trade-off to
realizing,
the
if we
funding
have
pursuit.
these discussions outside of this meeting with Caltrain staff, including the high level, and we are able to address arrange the technical issues, including ones related to the viaduct, then that could come back and say, oh, the viaduct doesn't have as many barriers as it looked like, or it does. And then maybe at our next rail committee meeting, we'll be more informed on that.
If that's allowable within what you, within your suggestion, sure.
Oh, so we've got two different things that we're going to do.
Okay.
We have a bunch of kind of engineering and cost related work. And then we have negotiations with Caltrain on these various technical standards. First, getting them in the right buckets, and then work through which ones are must-haves, which ones are variants, which ones can we resolve in short order.
Okay, so I think I hear you saying that what this could lead to is going back to council in April or whenever with some of these more detailed, variance discussions on the two, but also some more information on the viaduct so that we could ask council if they want to put it back on as an option. And here's all this other information about the other two options. Is that
Yeah.
where you're headed?
And
I support that.
And then anticipating getting on the council agenda, because it's been a long wait to get on the council agenda again, even though we've had some pretty light meetings to start this year. I haven't understood why this couldn't get on the council agenda. But having said that, as much as I'm anxious to get back before the council with some of these things, it seems like we may need to have the next month of dealing with Caltrain to try to resolve as many of these things as we can on the how the technical standards do or don't impact us. Come back to this committee to digest that, make recommendations to the council where appropriate and necessary, and have it penciled in on the council agenda to be before the council very shortly after the next rail committee meeting, which we could have. We don't have to wait a full month. If we had enough answers before then, we could try to move it forward. Yeah. But then on the funding part, we have a certain amount of funding for AECOM on the runway, but we need to go to the council for additional funding there. Presumably that could be go on to consent before we actually have a agendized council discussion on kind of policy matters. Is that correct, Kylie?
It's correct that it can go on consent. I'm not sure I just followed the timeline that you identified for council, which, if I did my math right, might be as soon as 6 weeks.
It could even be sooner than that. If we have more progress in a few weeks, that we don't wait a full month for the next rail committee meeting, then we might even have a rail committee meeting sooner than a month from now, and then go from there to the council as soon as possible after that. So what I want to do is try to make sure that we put a placeholder with the council.
Sure. I think we've got our vice mayor here who can help communicate this as part of the agenda setting process. We can indeed, looking at the March timeframe, pencil in a discussion with the full council on this. Couple thoughts come to mind. The detailed work to happen between the two parties over the next 4 or less weeks, I think will be, I'm curious if the committee intends for committee members to participate as part of that. And if so, you may consider making an action tonight to deputize one of you. So just something for your thoughts. In terms of a consent item and a contract, your postings are 2 weeks in advance. So there's, it's going to take over a month to get a contract amendment on your agenda. So I think staff can work on that, and it sounds like we've got some runway to, continue the work during that interim period and then move forward with the adjustment.
And we won't have all that technical analysis by the Natural Rail Committee meeting that we're engaging, but we will hopefully have progress on the AECom work and otherwise, I'm saying, but we hopefully will have progress on narrowing these technical standard issues. So March isn't the end of the story.
Just a point of clarification for myself, make sure I'm following the pieces. The more detailed technical review with AECom, is that the piece in which the committee intends to narrow our focus on options?
Yes. Outcomes.
Okay.
The outcomes from that discussion could help rail committee.
And whereas the meetings with Caltrain on technical issues, the meetings with Caltrain on the technical issues would be on the broader range of including viaduct related issues.
Got it. Not that this would preclude us. I'd have to go back and look and see if we would potentially, just to be fully transparent, 2 items to the council. Like, we could do one that has the rail committee recommending staff do an amendment with a more focused, that's an easy, quick consent item, and then follow it with the contract, versus staff actually executing the contract before we get that confirmation. Let me just check that. I don't think it'll slow up the process. We can move things in tandem. Acknowledging time is important, but just want to put that out there so that no one's surprised.
Okay.
I just wanted to comment on Kylie's comment that I don't think we need a deputy because we have a chair. So I think the chair would be interacting with the outsiders as representing the committee.
If I may, another thing to think about is you may want to do this as a 2-step thing for the council, because we haven't had a rail update in a very long time. So you might consider doing a study session on a special day, a special meeting, and then have a regular city council meeting where this is agendized and you guys could take action. Because I mean, you have the potential of getting a lot of public comment. You have new members who've never really talked about rail at a city council meeting. So that might be something you guys think about in scheduling. And I'm sorry, because I know it means more staff reports and more stuff. And I recognize that the transportation department is hurting right now, so.
And also to add, do we need to have an outreach before going to the city council? In addition to for making community aware of that, we are narrowing it down, and these are the newer.
Yeah, well, and if we have a study session, I'm not sure that we would need a separate meeting. So we might do outreach to make sure there's really awareness of the study session, inviting public participation there, and hopefully combining the two.
Okay, so the study session in itself.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, great. No, that's good
Given
to
the
know.
timing. Yeah.
I also wanted to ask the attorney that's here. So I'm an ex officio member. I don't vote on this committee. But because we have such a small time constraint, is it allowable for me to meet with other city council members that are not on this committee to explain and work through some of these technical things with them? I've found that it helps meetings go better, but I want to be mindful of how it might impact anything.
We can discuss that offline.
Okay. Zeroing in on our actions then.
Can I ask it just a clarify? Just to help me make sure I understand, there's the work of the Caltrain team, our consultants, the Palo Alto staff, to walk through the comments, put the comments into the various buckets. What are policy? What are must-haves? What are those flexibility? Having conversations about what knobs could be turned with where we are today, what knobs would need to be explored later when we're in preliminary engineering, we know more details. And with that, what that implications would be for the drawings. And then AECom would work to illustrate what that outcome would be, whether the footprint gets bigger or smaller. And I wasn't sure whether it's the drawings, whether it's the illustrations, but what's the product that they would produce? And then there's some sort of public outreach process and city council process with the updated product. Do I understand the process we've been talking about?
So, so at this time, we probably will be looking at plan and profiles. Once we have a better guidelines, we can look into updating it with renderings or other things. But that's where I would think that we would do a minimal work that's necessary for a rail committee to have that visibility of what alternatives are. That's what my collection is from this discussion today, is that we're looking at this minimal effort to look at what are the impacts of the various categories of comments, like policy comments, what are the leeways that we have, same thing with the constructability and also are the policy ones. So we look at those in these different baskets, have discussion with them which one will affect these, and try to show that on a plan and profile at the most, and then come back and come back to the rail committee either in March or February, March likely.
Ripon, I think you might also want the matrix updated. So we've got alternatives on there that we haven't talked about for years that can be removed, like the above grade.
So I'd like to
tunnel.
note that we, as a part of the previous studies, analyses, and updates that were guided through the work plan for rail committee and adopted council, we were planning on coming in next meeting to share the updated matrix and the studies that were conducted. There was some like traffic analysis, additional traffic analysis that we have conducted for bike ped, corridor timings and connectivity review. We also did some, sustainability and sea level effect. We also looked at some of the environmental impacts. So all those we were updating our matrix and coming back at the next meeting.
And the issue that Eric Nordman raised about those traffic volumes, is that something we're able to take a second look at?
So I think we have discussed, Eric and I have discussed extensively before. We have brought in Hexagon, who are our traffic consultants. They have looked into it more. We have talked to VTA about the modeling of how this modeling works, and there are a lot of things that goes behind the scenes in the models, which look at the boundary lines data from other cities and like the regional MTC models. And we may not be able to capture where all this growth and traffic distribution is changing over the next 10, 20 years, because this model were from 2015 or 10 projecting to 2030. The change in the land use, a smaller land use near the project could make a bigger impact in the turning moments that are affected at this. So there are several like zoning and other within the city, outside the city, and at the regional level population changes that affects this model. And it's very difficult to predict. And these are all, again, models, and we definitely.
So I appreciate it, and things have changed. I mean, we have hybrid work changing, our regional population growth has changed, but we have significant housing anticipated, including in South Palo Alto in that period. I'd just be interested at that time on even an understanding of why those patterns don't seem logical in the jump. So we can talk about that later. Given that I know we need to come to the action on the recommendation, do we need to refine?
Chair Burt, would it be helpful if I pulled up the recommended
That'd
action?
be great. Thank you. Do we need to refine in any way what you put in the staff report to reflect where we're headed? And if so, what would that wording be?
Do you see?
Ask for more money.
Okay, here's what we got.
So I believe that the direction is to go with staff, is city to go directly with our consultant, projects consultant to coordinate and for any material changes on the alternative concepts and have those discussions with Caltrain in addressing those issues that relates to those elements, right of way, vertical elements, horizontal alignments, but they were more in category of now as constructability, design, and policy elements. So maybe we are changing those buckets to kind of align with the feasibility of those elements based on the characteristics of that. So
Okay,
Ruben, can you read those again for us so that the city clerk can,
yeah.
those
Can you
categories, I think.
Offer any,
design.
Should I take away? Should I remove A through D?
We can. Because policy changes like the right of way encroachment and some of these vertical things could come under policy.
It'd be better to have more on the list than fewer.
Okay. Policy, design, and constructability.
What's the intent behind the miscellaneous items? Is that just,
So that was more like on the roadway elements, if there was something more critical
Okay.
that needed to be identified.
Okay.
If there was, like any other element that was not characterized in that
okay,
those three
understood.
categories before, so we could capture it and not
Understood.
be able to.
okay, so then this revised motion captures where we're going?
Do we need anything for the extra request for additional funds, or are we just saying that the kickoff
That's right.
funds are there?
Yeah.
So we would need to do a amendment of an agreement with a funding agreement with VTA also to seek additional funding from our Measure B grade separation funds.
Well,
That we would
and
have to do.
do we need to recommend the increase to AECom go to the council on consent?
Yeah, might just add a number 3 on here to kind of have a rounding out of the overall arching direction from the committee. So something to the effect of staff to proceed with appropriate contract amendments and funding needs to support the above. And I guess AECom and
So that
Caltrain.
cap, just leave it that broad and that gets it. If you're good with it.
If you're good with it.
Yeah, okay,
If you're good with it.
all right.
Yeah.
Do we have a motion to approve?
So moved.
I was gonna say the same thing, so, yes, yes.
Okay. Can the clerk please call the roll?
Councilwoman Binker,
Yes.
Councilman Lowing,
Yes.
Chair Burt,
Yes.
motion passes.
All
And-
right.
Thank you all.
Thanks to everybody. I think as of right now, our next rail committee meeting would be on the is that the 3rd or 4th Tuesday?
February 20th.
20th. So tentatively scheduled for February 20th at 2:30. And thanks, everybody. This has been a very substantive meeting. Yes.
Can I just say real quick?
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that this is my last rail committee meeting, so I've been reassigned in the shuffling of committees, but it's really been a joy. I came onto it with some trepidation, but it's been fun to learn it. And now I'm glad that when it comes to council, I'll have some background. 'Cause
Right.
this is a lot. But I want to thank the community members for coming and giving their input. It's really been helpful over the year. Because we have such talent in this community and experience. And so that's been fabulous. I want to thank our partners at Caltrain and my colleagues here for helping me climb that learning curve. And I'm sure we're going to go on to do great things and make some decisions. All right, thanks.
It's a great topic to geek out on. Yes, yeah. All right, thank you all.